Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description. The Devil Wears White. The ASL trio have been kidnapped, taken to a place that people only see in their nightmares. Children are tested on and lives are thrown away carelessly. How will they escape? If they do, who can they trust? And what's with these strange new powers? Now this is the season 1 of this fanfiction. It will have a season 2 where the same Luffy starts his adventure as from East Blue like in canon, but stronger and experienced. I don't own anything, adios.
Do you think this island will have a cool adventure? Luffy asked, head resting on his hands which were on the railing. He was staring at what seemed to be the endless ocean, though he knew that in the direction he was looking there was an island. Ace had said so himself. Who knows, Lou, we'll just have to find out for ourselves when we get there, Ace said from where he stood beside Luffy. Sabou was on Luffy's other side as he also looked in the direction of where the island was. But we won't get there for a whole another day, Luffy whined, wishing he could stretch far enough to grab onto the island, even if he couldn't see it yet. Just be patient, Luffy. You didn't mind waiting when you didn't know there was an island, Sabou said with a smile. 'Cause I didn't know there was an island, Luffy said, making Ace and Sabou laugh. Why don't we? Sabou didn't finish his sentence when he saw Luffy turn his head away from where the island was, a frown on his face. Teach? Ace growled out in question, known purely from the look on Luffy's face. He turned to look where Luffy was looking and confirmed it himself, watching as the man drifted slowly towards them on one of the mini-mobis. Luffy hummed, more for Sabou than Ace now. I think now's a good time to visit Whitebeard then, Sabou asked, standing up straighter with his brothers and heading towards the captain. They sat in front of him like they usually did, no one finding this odd anymore after having seen the brothers do it multiple times in the past weeks, and waited as Teach eventually made his way to the mobi. The three didn't even turn to watch him board, all three of them doing their best to ignore his entire presence, but knowing that they couldn't because they had to keep an eye on him. They didn't want the bastard to hurt anyone, not when they had the perfect ability to keep tabs on him without having to see him. Sabou made sure to keep focused on any and every conversation Teach had while Luffy would check the aura of anyone Teach interacted with, making sure no one got even a speck of gray in their auras after talking with the man. Ace, as much as he wanted to also help keep an eye on Teach, knew he wouldn't be able to do so without attracting unwanted attention, so instead he focused on facing forward and letting his brothers handle it, knowing they could do it better than he could, as well as inconspicuously. Whitebeard watched the brothers, not for the first time, focusing on Teach, whether they looked like they were or not. After Luffy had explained to them how Sabou would listen in on the man, Whitebeard had noticed it more often. The blonde brother would grow more silent than usual and would have a look of concentration, eyes slightly downcast as he did. The captain took no offense when he did this, even if it did mean he wasn't listening to whatever the captain was saying. He understood what and why Sabou was doing what he was doing it, and he also knew how difficult it was for the brothers to continue being near Teach. It hurt Whitebeard though, that someone he had come to accept as a son could be doing all of this as an act. If there was one thing Whitebeard disliked the most, it was traitors. For him to give Teach a home, a place to belong, safety, protection, and watch the man use it to his advantage knowing he was doing all of this for his benefit, using them made the captain both angry and hurt. It wasn't something he could control though, and for now, he was just going to have to continue keeping an eye on the man. Now where did I leave off on my last story? Whitebeard asked, more to himself. The brothers briefly gave their attention to him at the words before smiling and going back to what they were doing. Ah, that's right, we had just finished the battle with our third marine ship in 20 minutes, Whitebeard said with a smile. If all he could do was provide the brothers a cover as they kept tabs on Teach, he would do it. Breakfast came and passed and the brothers found themselves walking through the halls with Namur and Marco. The two commanders were heading down below deck to go count their inventory, make sure they had enough supplies and make sure no one was stealing from their stores. So why were the brothers going with them? Well, that was easy. Teach had been heading near them again, so in a desperate attempt to keep away from the man, the three had gone to the closest commanders to them, which happened to be Marco and Namur as the two passed them on their way to the inner workings of the mobi. The two had understood immediately why the brothers had sought them out so suddenly without much of a reason after seeing Teach walking close by, eyeing the trio as they joined Marco and Namur. They invited the brothers to come with them, and they had agreed quickly, which was how they found themselves in their current situation. Do you have any idea why Teach seems to seek you three out so much? Namur asked after his conversation with Marco ended. The brothers frowned but shook their heads. Maybe he knows we're the kids from the papers, but even then, I don't know what he wants with us, Sabou suggested, trying to think of reasons as to why the man would continue to attempt to make conversation with them. Maybe he thinks we're strong or something, Ace said with the usual scowl he wore whenever Teach was involved. He gets the greedy feelings whenever he sees us, and the dark ones. Luffy piped up with a frown of his own. Like Ace's scowl. Whenever Teach was involved, Luffy became much more quiet and reserved compared to the more outgoing teen he was starting to become. Greedy? Marco asked in confusion. Like the feeling Izo gets when he sees clothes he wants, or like the doctors got whenever they liked the answers and wanted to do more tests. Luffy explained with a bit of a shiver, not enjoying the memory of the last example. The doctor's greed, like Teach's, was slimy and unsettling, whereas Izo's greed had been light-hearted and easy, no ill intent behind it. Teach has the bad greed. The slimy greed. Luffy added. Now everyone frowned, contemplating Luffy's words and trying to figure out what it meant and why Teach was so focused on the brothers. He might want us to help him do whatever it is he's planning, but that seems a bit far-fetched, Sabou said, sighing after. Trying to figure out what Teach's motivations were was both frustrating and exhausting. He began to sympathize with the pirates, feeling a bit bad that this is probably how they had felt when they had tried figuring out just what had happened at the facility. There's no use worrying about it now, Yoi. Unless Teach tells us outright or you overhear something, Sabou, we won't know what he's up to. Like Oyaji says, we'll just have to continue keeping an eye on him and try to prepare for whatever he's planning. Marco said, soothing everyone with his words as they realized he was right. The group walked along silently now, heading further down into the Mobi. So, we should have plenty of extra bandages after our last restock, and Whiskey said she found a box someone hadn't counted last time, so we even have more than we thought. Right there is good. Vista called to the brothers, who all stopped, putting the barrels they held down. Thanks again for the help, you three, Vista said as he walked up to them, smile on his face. The brothers smiled back and shrugged. It's no issue, it gave us something to do. It felt weird to just watch and do nothing to help out, Sabou said honestly. After checking the inventory with Marco and Namur, it had been lunchtime. The meal had passed by without any incidents, and after the trio had been sitting on the railing with Vista. Soon after, however, he excused himself, saying he had to oversee his division who was moving barrels both onto and off the deck. The brothers had spent a few minutes watching but felt a little weird doing nothing to help. Luffy had been the one suggesting they help, and Ace and Sabou found themselves agreeing with him. It was good Exiat. Still, if I were you, I'd probably have sat there and done nothing. The commander said with a wink, making the brothers smile. Yeah, well, we like moving around and doing things. Sitting around was getting boring, Ace said, stretching his arms as he spoke. It felt good for the three to move around and do something. After years of sitting most of their days away in a cell, it felt unbearable to not do anything. Now that they were finally relaxing and becoming comfortable with the pirates, the trio wanted more and more to help out and move around. Well, I sure won't stop you. Having extra hands helping out is always nice. Thanks to you three, we should be done moving all of these barrels before dinner, Vista said with a grin, hand on his hip as he spoke. Luffy smiled happily back at him, enjoying all the nice feelings coming from the man. In the midst of all the happy feelings though, Luffy could feel the darkness from Teach slowly creeping his way over, causing Luffy's smile to falter as his eyes darted over to the man heading their way. Luffy's teeth clenched and he swallowed, feeling the anxiety making his body tremble slightly from just the thought of the man getting close to him. The young team's change in mood was obvious to the other three, and it didn't take long for Ace and Sabou to zero in on Teach heading their way once again. Vista was quick to notice as well, but no one could do anything to stop it. The brothers didn't want to walk away from the commander in case Teach went after them and caught them alone, but they didn't want to stay put either and watch him grow closer and closer. Vista wasn't sure what to do either. On one hand, this was someone he had considered his brother for a decade now, someone he had thought he could trust, but seeing the brothers' reaction to him only confirmed what they had said about the man having ill intentions. It left a weird feeling in him, and he wasn't quite sure how to describe it. It was an oddly stomach-dropping feeling, but also the feeling of the breath being knocked out of him at the same time. Like he couldn't breathe. Teach's smile was as easygoing as it always was, and Vista found himself analyzing it, trying to find the maliciousness that Luffy could sense so well from the man. He found nothing, though he didn't really expect to find anything, and it only made him that much more angry at both himself and at Teach. He and the others should have been able to catch the fact that Teach wasn't showing them his true nature. They should have been able to stop him on their own, but if they hadn't met Luffy and his brothers, chances were that they would never have guessed that Teach was planning anything bad at all until it was too late. Not that he was mad at the brothers or anything though, he was actually grateful that they were here, both because it meant they didn't have to stay in that damned facility, and also because they had found Teach out. He felt a bit guilty though. Guilty that he hadn't caught Teach before he could cause harm to the brothers like this. It wasn't like the man was doing anything to them, but just his presence made the trio look sick to their stomachs, and honestly, they probably were. Commander, all the barrels moved yet? Teach asked as he walked up to Vista, his smile still in place and a friendly look in his eyes that still perplexed Vista. Teach was one hell of an actor. Sure are, the last few are being brought up now. Vista replied with his own smile, and he only hoped he was as good an actor as Teach was, because as much as he wanted to get rid of Teach, he knew he couldn't, not when he hadn't actually done anything yet. The brothers stood quietly behind Vista, all three of them trying not to make eye contact with the bearded man they feared. Luffy stood squarely behind the commander, making it impossible to even see Teach, which calmed him slightly, even if he could feel the darkness still creeping into him. That's good, the second division was getting antsy. Rumor was that we were going to have to help out, and you know how lazy they get about manual labor this close to dinner, Teach said, laughing afterward. Vista gave his own laugh, forcing himself to find the humor in Teach's words. It was true. Second division often got lazy in the afternoons, and it was always a hassle to get them to help out when they needed it. Because of this, they were usually sent to do watch or check inventory. In that case, they can rest easy, we're all good here. If you'll excuse me though, I was just about to take the brothers to Marco. You wouldn't happen to know where he is, would you? Vista asked, knowing it would be best for everyone if he got the brothers away from Teach and towards someone they seemed to be able to relax around. It didn't get past anyone that the brothers had a fondness for Marco, and even Thatch as well. Marco claimed that no such thing was true, but everyone had noticed how watchful he'd become of the brothers. Thatch, on the other hand, had been quick to claim that he was best friends with the brothers, whether it was true or not. Last I saw, Commander Marco, he was checking up on Oyaji again. Apparently, he's giving the nurses a hard time about taking his medication today. I think they were trying to limit his alcohol intake again, and he threatened limiting his medicine intake, Teach said with a shake of his head. Vista found himself sighing and shaking his head too, knowing that Whitebeard could be stubborn about certain things, alcohol being one of them. Thanks, talk to you later, Teach, Vista said, waving to the man as he ushered the boys away from Teach. Teach smiled and waved back, saying his own goodbye as he watched them go. Thanks, Sabou said with a sigh of relief as they moved further and further away from the man they hated. No problem, kid. Now, do you three think you could distract Whitebeard long enough for the nurses to hide his alcohol? Vista asked with a grin. Similar grins grew on the trio's faces as they all nodded. Mr. Whitebeard, can you tell us a story? A really long one, with a lot of action and stuff. Luffy called as he ran over to Whitebeard. The captain looked over to the young teen with a smile, momentarily stopping his argument with the nurse beside him. Leave it to us, Vista, Ace said as he followed after Luffy, Sabou close behind. Vista laughed as he connected eyes with Marco, who was just making his way up to Whitebeard. Don't worry, Marco, I think the brothers have this one handled, the commander said knowingly. He got a look of skepticism from Marco, but he chose to ignore it. The brothers had been successful in distracting Whitebeard, the three of them watching as Marco and another nurse they didn't know the name of snuck off with the barrel of sake Whitebeard had beside him. Of course, it didn't take long for the perceptive captain to notice, but he merely laughed about it before continuing with his story, not seeming angry in the slightest, which Luffy confirmed he wasn't. It was the beginning of dinner now. Ace, Sabou, and Luffy had all just sat down, ready to eat, and the rest of the crew was still slowly crowding into the galley. Noticeably, Teach had yet to arrive, and Sabou was making sure to keep an ear on him. Currently, the man was in his room doing who knew what. Conversation arose around the trio, and Thatch gave them all their dinner before he sat in front of them, talking animatedly, gestures included as he did. Luffy took it upon himself to respond to the chef, his own gestures and faces matching Thatch's enthusiasm in a way that made Ace and Sabou briefly wonder if he was being influenced or not. Sabou tuned back into Teach and realized he was done fiddling with whatever it was he had been fiddling with, and by the sounds of it he was dialing a number on a snail phone. Curiosity piqued, Sabou focused more of his attention on the man and what he was doing, tuning out the conversations around him. He briefly noticed Ace and Luffy catching onto his sudden focused state, the two of them growing quiet as they watched him. For a few seconds before the telltale, "Gotcha," sounded and whoever Teach was calling answered. The loud conversations in the galley drowned out some of it, but Sabou was able to hear enough to get the gist of the conversation. At one point Teach gave a frustrated sigh and muttered out, haven't found it yet." That confused Sabou, but he tried not to think too much about it and focused his attention back to the talking. The conversation lasted only a few minutes at most, and Sabou didn't hear most of it, but what he had heard confirmed, to him at least, that Teach was definitely up to something, and from the sounds of it, he was looking for something he'd yet to find. "Sabou?" Ace asked, Luffy noticing his brother had gone from focused to confused and telling Ace as much. "Did you hear something?" Luffy asked with a frown, knowing it would most likely be Teach he had heard something from. Sabou nodded, still looking slightly confused. Teach just, Sabou cut himself off when he heard the galley doors open, and the devil himself walked in, friendly smile on his face as he walked to the food, grabbed some and made his way to his usual table, laughing and joking easily with those already there. "Called someone," Sabou continued, picking up where he left off. He knew the commanders and Whitebeard were listening intently, all of them wanting to know just what Teach was up to. "What did they talk about?" Izo asked with a frown, eyes darting over to Teach, the Mont's back to him. "I didn't get a lot of it, it's too loud in here, but I heard Teach mention he hasn't found something yet," Sabou said, starting to eat his food now. "Hasn't found something yet? Did he say what?" Rikuyo asked. Sabou shook his head. "No, or at least I didn't hear what it was." The other person was a bit annoyed, but Teach did some explaining to him, something about how it would all be worth it in the end, and the other guy conceded. Sabou explained, everyone, frowning now. So whatever he's planning probably relies heavily on whatever it is he's trying to find then, Fosa deduced. Most likely. Sabou agreed, stealing his own glance at Teach. Maybe that's why he's always volunteering to go on missions. Maybe it's because he's trying to find whatever thing he's looking for, Namur suggested. That's likely. Who was the other person that he was talking to though? Kimdu asked, reminding everyone that this meant Teach had more people in on whatever he was planning. He didn't sound like anyone I've heard on the ship before. It was a man though, Sabou said with a shrug, thinking back to the voice. It wasn't familiar to him in the slightest, so he'd probably never met the person before. So he's got people outside of the crew that he's working with then, Yoi, Marco said with a nod. That was slightly good news at least. It meant that there was only one traitor on board. That could be possible. We'll have to continue keeping an eye on him in that case. Whitebeard agreed with a nod. Teach probably wouldn't meet up with this person with others around, but it was possible that he could, and if he did, they would be ready for it. The conversation dropped after that, and slowly the previous conversation picked up. In no time Thatch was smiling and gesturing wildly again, Luffy doing the same, and Sabou and Ace found themselves engrossed in the tale, both of them trying to ignore the fact that Teach sat only a few tables away. Luffy made sure to pay attention to whether the darkness got any worse or not, but for the most part, he too tried ignoring Teach. He didn't like the man and he wanted to avoid him at all costs, but he wanted to keep the Whitebeard safe, and to do that he had to keep tabs on the man and his darkness. He just had to wait until they could take Teach down, and right now, they couldn't do that. Not when he hadn't done anything yet. Dinner passed easily after that, everyone finishing their meals slowly but surely until they were milling back out onto deck. The trio stayed up for a little longer, hanging out with Thatch, Haruda, and Izo in the meantime, but soon they were saying their good nights and heading to their room. Watching Teach all the time was exhausting and mentally taxing for the brothers, but as long as they continued to rely on the other commanders and Whitebeard, then they had a feeling they would be able to get through this. The brothers were excited to land at the new island like always. It was fun for them to explore the new islands, even if more times than not they were interrupted prematurely by a bad event. This time was no different, and the time after that probably wouldn't be either. It was something the three didn't think they could ever get used to. The freedom to sail the seas, to land on new islands all around the world, it was exhilarating. It showed they were free, out of the facility that had held them captive for most of their lives. They were paired up with Marco, Jozu, and Haruda for their newest outing. The 12th Division needed some supplies from one of the villages on the island and Jozu apparently knew the way to the village seeing as it was normally his division that went to get the supplies. He and Haruda had decided to come along with the brothers and Marco, and they saw no issue with that, even going as far as to agree to help carry the supplies back. Stepping onto the island, they found themselves in a village that had people bustling around. It was midday now, so it was no surprise that the villagers were out and about. Apparently, this island had 2 villages, and this wasn't the one they needed to be in. The group followed Jozu as he maneuvered through the small village, and soon they were heading out on a barely visible path that obviously wasn't used a lot, if at all. They were surrounded by trees as they walked, but Ace could see that it cleared up further up ahead. In the clearing, he could see a big circular structure that almost looked like a coliseum or something similar. "What's the giant structure ahead of us?" Ace asked Jozu, thinking the man might know seeing as he had walked this path before. It was still a good 30 minutes ahead of them, but without any trees to block his vision Ace could see it clearly. "Oh, you can see that already? I'm not really sure. I think it's a temple or something though. The village we're heading to is weirdly religious and I think they used to use it in ceremonies or something of the sorts, but I never ask too many questions. Honestly, the people there give me the creeps so I normally get the supplies as quickly as possible and get out," Jozu said with a shake of his head. "Big bad Jozu's scared of a tiny little village," Haruda teased, nudging the third commander with his elbow. Jozu glared at Haruda while Marco rolled his eyes at the two's antics. "I'm not scared, Haruda. I get unnerved is all. As I said, they're creepy and heavy into the whole religion thing. It's almost like that one story Thatch told about the crazy zealots trying to summon demons that they thought would heal the world," Jozu said as he made air quotes, causing Marco and Haruda both to raise their eyebrows at him while the brothers listened on in interest. "You mean the one story where he claimed they tried to sacrifice him?" Marco asked in confusion. "Yeah, that's the one," Jozu agreed with a nod. "Jozu, you do know Thatch's stories are supposed to be taken with a grain of salt, right? Especially when he's drunk. For all we know, that story is actually about a squirrel that looked at him the wrong way and he turned it into the crazy religious sacrifice story we all know and love," Haruda said. Ace and Sabou shared a look at that, wondering how a squirrel looking at Thatch the wrong way correlated to the story he had told, but they merely shrugged and returned to listening. "I didn't say I believed it, I just said that's what it reminds me of. For all we know that's what the structure is for. Sacrifices," Jozu said defensively with a frown. Haruta laughed at that and Marco was once again shaking his head, muttering about how stupid his brothers could be, which made Sabou smile knowingly, looking at his own idiot brothers. I'm sure that's exactly what it's used for, Haruta said as he nodded his head in mock agreement. Jozu scowled. I'm just saying that you never know when the people in the village are creepy. That's it, Jozu said, scowl still present. No need to continue defending yourself. I'm agreeing with you here, Jozu, Haruta said as he patted Jozu's arm, which only earned him another glare. Haruta snickered now but decided to ease off on the teasing for now. Are you two done now, Yoi? Marco asked them with a frown, almost like a parent who was one step away from grounding their children. Yes, Mom. Haruta moaned while Jozu rolled his eyes, knowing better than to egg on an impatient Marco. Remind me again why we agreed to go with them, Marco asked, turning to look at the brothers who all merely shrugged back. We were all going to the island, so why not go together? Sabou asked with a smile, still thoroughly enjoying the conversation. Marco sighed but didn't say anything in response. After some more time spent walking quietly through the trees on their nearly invisible path, they finally reached the structure that Ace and Jozu had been talking about. It did look oddly Colosseum-like in the way it was shaped, but the stone structures and patterns screamed temple. It had a path all the way around it, and Jozu told them that they would have to circle around to the other side of the temple to continue going towards the village. As they walked up to the structure, they all took in the intricate carvings in the stone. There were small patterns like flowers and swirling patterns, and then there were bigger carvings that created beautiful statues of women and men all holding various objects, from vases to scepter-looking objects. Columns were also carved out of the stone, as well as archways that allowed the group to see inside the temple, but all they could see was hallways lined with more columns that led to stairs going up. You know, I could see a religious cult doing sacrifices here, Haruta said as he peered inside the temple. Jozu didn't respond to the words, but he did cross his arms over his chest as he gave the 12th commander an "I told you so" look. The group continued walking, peering in every archway but seeing only the same hall leading to stairs. Eventually, they made their way around the temple and were heading back on another overgrown path that led into another patch of trees. How far away is this village, Yoi? Marco asked curiously. He hadn't explored this island much before, never venturing further than the main village that they always docked at, so he had no clue how much longer of a walk they had ahead of them. Shouldn't be more than another half hour now, Jozu replied as he moved a tree branch out of their path. I think it's safe to say that this village is pretty secluded from the other, Haruta said, looking around at all the trees that surrounded them. Only further proving my case that they're crazy zealots, Jozu pointed out, but Haruta didn't respond. Ace, Sabou, and Luffy, who had been mostly quiet this entire time, looked around with smiles on their faces. There was something about being surrounded by trees that made the three feel at home. Safe. Of course, this could be attributed to the fact that they grew up in a place filled with trees, but they didn't pay too much mind to that. Luffy was itching to go climbing in one of the trees, to find the tallest one he could and climb all the way to the top of it, and honestly, Ace and Sabou felt much the same way as he did. They restrained themselves from doing so, but after looking at Luffy, who was practically vibrating with pent-up energy, they both sighed. If you promise to stay in the trees along the path, Sabou said suddenly, surprising the commanders as they turned their heads to see what Sabou was talking about. Really? Luffy asked excitedly, now jumping up and down beside Sabou in excitement. And you have to stay with Ace, Sabou added as an afterthought, knowing that if he didn't leave the boy with one of the older two he would get himself lost. Even if they did go with him, there was still a possibility of him getting lost, but at least this way Ace would probably be able to find him quickly with his sight, and if they needed him, they could yell and Sabou would hear aid, grabbing Ace's hand and pulling him towards the tree closest to them. Ace, who wore a smile of his own, followed easily. Luffy stretched his arm up towards a sturdy branch and promptly lifted both himself and Ace up into the tree. What are they doing, Yoi? Marco asked as he watched the two begin hopping through the different trees, though always staying within their sight. These trees remind us of home. Luffy wanted to go climbing and I agreed as long as he stays close and with Ace. Sabou said as he watched his brothers swing along the branches like monkeys. Don't you want to go too? Jozu asked, not wanting to keep the team back from having fun. The brothers deserved to have some fun after everything they'd been through. Nah, I'd rather not spend all my energy trying to keep up with those two. After all, it's a long walk back. If anything happens I'll be able to hear them. The blonde said. The commanders seemed to accept this explanation and they turned back around, now watching Ace and Luffy as they walked. The two were definitely energetic as they jumped, swung and, in Luffy's case, rocketed back and forth across the path, crisscrossing through the trees as they slowly yet surely continued down the path. They listened to Sabou's instructions and stayed strictly within the trees lighting the path, but that didn't seem to bother them. Luffy at one point climbed to the very top of one of the trees up ahead, hand shielding his eyes from the sun as he looked ahead towards the direction they were heading towards. He shouted something to Ace and pointed towards wherever he was looking, waiting for the eldest brother to make his way up the tree. Ace looked towards the direction before nodding, saying something back to Luffy before the two disappeared back into the trees. Luffy thought he saw something weird in the town, so he asked Ace what it was. Sabou explained for those who didn't know what had been said. Something weird? Haruta asked, looking towards the town that was now visible ahead of them. Sabou nodded, frowning. Yeah, and apparently it's nothing good, Sabou said, which further confused the commanders as they tensed. What do you mean? Marco asked, wanting to know what they were walking into. Looks like these people might be as crazy as Jozu said they were. Ace answered before Sabou could, he and Luffy jumping out of the trees and onto the path in front of them. How so? Marco asked, still not sure what was happening in the town. This wasn't one of Whitebeard's territories, but that didn't mean they would let anyone do anything to the villagers without reason. Looks like there's a trial going on, and from the looks of it the girl's not winning her case. Ace said, turning to look towards the village, walking quickly with Luffy at his side. More information would be helpful, you know, Sabou said with a sigh, becoming a bit annoyed with Ace's vagueness. Ace merely rolled his eyes but sighed. Some girl in chains is getting questioned and the villagers don't look too happy with her. They have a cross in the town center and everything. Wouldn't be surprised if they plan to burn her at the stake, Ace said, making everyone frown and quicken their pace as well. Can you hear what's happening? Haruta asked Sabou. The blonde frowned, but nodded, focusing on the village. Yeah, hold on. Alright, they're questioning her like Ace said. Calling her a heretic, saying she isn't a true believer anymore. Yeah, definitely sounds like they're not listening to a word she's saying. Sabou agreed. The group was now on the outskirts of the village, Jozu taking the lead as he showed them how to get to the town center where everything was taking place. Gray color. Luffy tapped, everyone picking up on the word as they turned to look at Luffy. Where? Ace asked, his eyes scanning over the crowd of people they were standing at the edges of. Big guy over there, the one shouting at the girl. Luffy said, nodding towards the man in question, eyes locked onto him. Everyone frowned as they took in the scene in front of them. Ace and Sabou's descriptions had been pretty accurate as a girl in chains was on her knees in front of the man with the gray aura. The two of them were up on a platform, a giant cross behind them and a pile of wood off to the side. The girl had pale green hair and blue eyes, barely looking to be older than 15, and was wearing a white pristine dress, no shoes on her bare feet. She was crying as she tried to explain whatever she had done, but the man was hearing none of it, interrupting her every time she attempted to speak. Said man was big and burly, with no hair on his head besides his eyebrows. He wore an angry scowl and his face was nearly red with the effort it took to yell at the poor girl. As Ace had said before, it looked as if they were getting ready to burn the girl on the cross, and no one looked like they had any disagreements with this besides a boy near the front who was being held back by a few of the townspeople. He was young as well, no more than 10 or 11, and had brown hair and blue eyes that looked the same as the girl's. Possibly a sibling. Please, listen, I beg you. Heretics don't have the right to speak. You went against God's will and for that, you will be rightfully punished. The man screamed, the crowd cheering in agreement. Please, I believe, I do. Lies. We'll hear no more lies out of you. Non-believer, the man screamed, once again cutting the sobbing girl off. Two of the villagers made their way up the platform and walked up to the girl, grabbing her by both of her arms and hoisting her up. Send her to the cells, prepare her for the sacrifice. The man called to the men, both of them nodding as they dragged her off the platform. People were screaming in agreement and throwing stones at the girl as she was dragged past them. At the man's words, Jozu sent Haruta a look, which the 12th commander promptly ignored. Now that the girl was gone, the man was leaving the platform as well and the crowd was beginning to disperse. Excuse me, Yoi, Marco said, grabbing someone by the shoulder as they passed, a man. Yes, he asked, any ill will aimed at the girl gone now as he inspected Marco curiously. Could you tell me what that was about? Marco asked, referring to the scene they'd all just witnessed. The man sneered, crossing his arms. That? Just dealing with a nuisance is all. You do best to just run along and let this town handle its own affairs. The man said, walking away before Marco could respond. Marco scoffed, turning to look to everyone else. Why don't we talk to the sad kid? Luffy asked, eyes trained on the boy that had been struggling to get to the platform earlier. The kid was still sobbing, but there was no one holding him back now. He was sitting on the ground, unmoving save for the shaking of his shoulders as he cried, fists clenched on the ground. Before getting a response, Luffy headed off to him, the others following. The crowd was all but gone now, and none of them seemed to pay any mind to the little boy. Hey, you, Luffy said bluntly, but it got the boy's attention. He wiped at his eyes as he looked up at Luffy. Huh? He asked in confusion. Luffy squatted in front of the boy, head tilted. She was important to you, right? Luffy asked, feeling the boy's distraught and misery. The boy's lip trembled again and he nodded. She's my older sister, he said softly, tears falling all over again. What did she do? Ace asked from where he stood behind Luffy. She didn't do anything, she just wanted to help, the boy said angrily, but his fury quickly turned to sorrow as he began crying once again. Ace gave a frustrated look to Sabou, who rolled his eyes, pushing Ace away from the kid as he knelt beside Luffy. "Hey, look, we didn't say she did anything wrong. We just want to know why they did that to her," Sabou said, much gentler than his brothers had been. The boy's tears stopped again as he studied Sabou. "She got medicine. F for our dad," he said, confusing everyone. "Medicine? All of this is happening over me in confusion." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes again. "We're not allowed to use medicine, cause it's God's will whether we get sick or not, live or die. Our dad was sick, and all he needed was a little bit of medicine, but they wouldn't let us help him. Mary just wanted to help our dad, so she went and got the medicine for him, but the others found out and took it before she could give it to him," he said, and Luffy could feel the sadness beginning to get stronger in the boy as he spoke. "Dad died that night and they took Mary to the cells. They're gonna make her repent and sacrifice her to make amends," he said, once again beginning to cry at the thought of what was to come. "Over medicine. All right, Jozu, you were right. This town is filled with crazy religious sacrificing zealots," Haruta said apologetically as he massaged his temples. Jozu decided not to say "I told you so." "What's your name, Yoi?" Marco asked. "Henry," he said quietly. Marco nodded. "Do you have any more family? Mom, aunt, uncle?" Jozu asked, but Henry shook his head. "Only Mary," he said sadly. "Well, Henry, we'll help your sister, so don't worry," Marco said, placing a hand comfortingly on Henry's shoulder. His eyes lit up, a hint of a smile on his face. "Really?" he asked. Marco nodded. "Sure will, kid," he said. Luffy smiled as he felt the elation filling the small boy. Henry jumped up, hugging Marco tightly. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," he chanted over and over. Marco smiled, ruffling the kid's hair. "Don't worry about it, Yoi. Why don't we have Haruta here take you to our ship? You can stay there while we take care of things, Yoi," Marco said, nodding to Haruta. "But what about the supplies?" Haruta asked. "Jozu can still get them and carry them back. Once you get Henry to the Mobi you can head back here. It might not be so easy as to just grab Mary and run, Yoi," Marco said, Haruta nodding in understanding. "Alright, I'll be as quick as I can. Come on Henry, let's go," Haruta said, ushering the boy back towards the path they'd used before. The group watched as they left for a minute before they continued. "Jozu, you go get the supplies and take them to the Mobi. When you get there tell Oyaji about what's happening if Haruta doesn't already," Marco said, Jozu nodding. "Should I come back too?" he asked, arms crossed as he looked around the village. It felt as if all eyes were on them and he was reminded of how creepy the town always felt whenever he was here. "No, we should keep our numbers to a minimum, and if we're sneaking around it'll be better to have fewer of us. Haruta coming back is already going to make us a bit obvious, Yoi," Marco said as he also looked around. He also had the sense of being watched, and from the looks of it, the brothers felt the same way as they shifted slightly, eyes darting around like they did when they were first on the Mobi. "Sounds good. See you guys soon," Jozu said, waving to them as he headed off to get the necessary supplies. Marco looked to the brothers, eyebrow raised and smile on his face. "So, how good are you three at sneaking around, Yoi?" Haruta and Henry walked silently through the woods. The 12th commander continued to steal glances at the boy every few minutes, wondering if he was okay. He looked fine, save for the worried look on his face that showed he was still thinking about his sister, which was understandable. "It's alright. Marco and the others will get your sister out of there, so there's no need to worry," Haruta said as comfortingly as he could manage. It wasn't often that he interacted with children, but when he did he wasn't exactly the best. Not the worst, but again, not the best. Henry hummed, but he didn't look all that convinced. Haruta sighed, eyebrows scrunched upwards in worry as he faced forward. He could see the temple up ahead and was reminded of all the questions they'd had before. Glancing to Henry again, he decided to ask him. He was someone who would probably know what the whole thing was about, and even if he didn't it might help him distract himself from his sister. "Hey Henry, what's with the big temple there?" Haruta asked, pointing to it. Henry looked up in confusion before a knowing look lit up his face, a contrast to his previously downturned one. "Oh, that's the temple of Zenshana, the god we all worship," Henry said, gazing at the temple in almost awe. "Have you ever been to it before?" Haruta asked, noticing the look on the kid's face as if he'd never seen it before. Henry shook his head. "It's sacred. The only time anyone's allowed to go to it is when there's a sacrifice or if it's your coming-of-age ritual," Henry said. As they grew closer to the temple the boy looked at all the carvings with admiration, lightly running his hand along the stone as they walked up to it. Haruta was glad that the kid was distracted because if not, he surely would have gotten sad all over again at the mention of the sacrifice. "Well, it's definitely beautiful," Haruta decided to say. Even if the town was crazy religious like Jozu had said, that didn't take away from the beauty of the temple any. It said it took 1,200 days and nights to build and carve this temple," Henry said as they walked around it. "I'm not surprised, there's a lot of detail put into it," Haruta said. Eventually, they were around the temple and continuing on the path through the woods and to the one sane village on the island. So have you ever been to the other village before? Haruta asked Henry after another pause in the conversation. No, we're not allowed to go there. Sometimes someone will come to our village, but it's only ever to trade supplies and that only happens a few times a year. Henry said. He didn't seem to be worrying about his sister anymore, too distracted by all the new things he was finally able to see. Then this should be pretty exciting then, you know, despite the circumstances. Haruta said, mumbling the last bit to himself. Henry nodded, but his expression faltered a bit, showing that he had heard Haruta. The 12th commander sighed. This was going to be a long walk. Well Marco, now's a good time to see how good you are at our silent language, Sabou said with a grin as he watched the first commander. Marco grinned back, Ace and Luffy catching his eye momentarily as they slunk off to the woods. Indeed it is, Yoi. Let's see how good a teacher you really are, Marco said, he and Sabou turning to walk towards where they had seen Mary dragged off earlier. The two lapsed into silence as they began scanning their surroundings. For having such a heated trial only moments ago, the village had quickly returned to looking peaceful and calm, people smiling and laughing as if nothing was wrong. If they hadn't seen the trial for themselves they would never guess anything was wrong. I can hear Mary in one of the buildings to the left. It's about 30 more feet ahead. There's a market 10 feet past that. We can blend in there. Sabou tapped as he tried deciphering all the sounds he was hearing as quick as he could. Marco nodded beside him, taking a bit of time to understand what Sabou had tapped. He wasn't as fluent as the brothers were, and this was the first time they were really communicating through the silent language, so he was a bit slow in translating it. We should head to the market then. Jozu might still be there. I can tell him the plan and you can listen to what's happening with Mary. We should try and find that man that Luffy said had the gray aura too. Marco tapped, Sabou nodding minutely in agreement. They walked down the street casually, as to not draw any more attention to themselves. Already, everyone they passed looked at them seeing as they were outsiders. They didn't need to make the townspeople any more suspicious of them. When they reached the market they scanned the crowd for Jozu, spotting him easily as he exchanged money for the supplies they had originally come for. As the third commander picked up the bags and turned to leave, Marco went up to him while Sabou went and sat on a bench, head turned up to the sky to make it look as if he was watching the clouds while he listened. He couldn't hear much coming from where Mary was being held. She was still crying, which Sabou decided was probably the normal reaction to knowing you were going to be sacrificed. Once again, Sabou was thankful he had the super hearing and not Ace, because the amounts of times he heard people crying would throw Ace into a rage. He could hear one other person in the same building as Mary, probably a guard, but they weren't talking, so Sabou ignored him. He made sure to keep some of his focus on Mary's building in case anyone tried to take her, and focused the rest of his hearing on finding the man Luffy had said had the gray aura. His voice had been deep and rough, and Sabou was sure he would be able to recognize it if he heard it again. He listened to as many voices as he could, tried focusing on individual buildings, individual rooms, hoping that he would hear him again. Marco sat beside him on the bench, breaking his focus momentarily as he did. He noticed that Jozu was leaving town now and guessed Marco had told him what the plan was, seeing as the first commander was now beside him. He pushed those thoughts away and began scanning the voices again. The east part of town was clear, as well as the south. North was nearly clear, and if he wasn't there that meant he was either in the west, or he had yet to speak, and Sabou would have to start his scan all over again. A few more minutes passed as Marco and Sabou sat in silence, the first commander watching the crowd, keeping an eye out for the man in case he walked by. Finally, Sabou was able to pinpoint him, hearing the man speak only a few houses away from where they sat. He's in that house there, talking to some other guys about the sacrifice. We were right, it's going to be at the temple. Waiting until night when the moon's out to do it, but they're going to take Mary there sooner when it's dark, Sabou said, relaying everything he heard to Marco as he heard it. The first commander gave a small nod in understanding as he listened, taking in all the information as it came. I'll keep an eye on the house and watch for anyone going in or out then. Keep an ear on Mary and the man in the meantime. Ace and Luffy should be back soon, Marco said, eyes darting over to the house Sabou had pointed out to him and watching the door. Sounds good. What, can't keep up? Ace teased as he turned to look back at Luffy, who was swinging through the trees, trying to catch up to him. Can too. You just left me behind is all, Luffy called as he grabbed the branch above Ace's head. That's because you were wasting time and climbing to the top of the trees again, Ace said as he rolled his eyes, turning and once again beginning his race through the trees. 'Cause I was trying to see Ruta, Luffy whined with a pout, following close behind his older brother. He's probably just getting back to the Mobi with Henry. It should still be another hour until he gets back, Ace said. Yeah, but maybe he's super fast or something, Luffy said, mind wondery of the commander having cool superpowers. Almost like him and his brothers, but without the whole testing thing. I doubt it. Anyway, come on, just up ahead should be far enough in, Ace said, pointing to a spot. Luffy nodded and the two went on in silence, only the rustling of the trees and the animals in the forest making sounds around them. You ready? Ace asked, looking at Luffy with a grin. Luffy smiled his classic D smile, laughing lightly. The sun was setting by the time Ace and Luffy finished up their work, the two of them sweating a bit as they stared at their handiwork. Looks pretty good to me. What do you think, Lou? Ace asked the youngest. Perfect. He cheered happily. Ace smiled to his brother and the two were about to head back to town to find Sabou and Marco when he spotted someone. Oh, Ruda, welcome back, Ace said with a grin, watching as Haruda walked up to them, eyebrows raised as he took in the area around them. Good to be back. I'm guessing there's a reason to all of this, Haruda said, gesturing to the area. Yeah, Marco and Sabou made this plan up and me and Ace got to come and do all of this while they did the boring stuff. Luffy explained. Haruda watched Luffy for a minute before shrugging, smiling as well. Sounds good to me. So, what is the plan? Haruda asked as the three began heading back towards town. Well, they're gonna sacrifice Mary or whatever, so Marco and Sabou got to thinking that they might take her to that temple. You know, the one Jozu suggested they might be sacrificing people in, Ace began. Haruda nodding along as he listened. Good guess. Henry told me that's where they do their ceremonies and sacrifices, so chances are that's exactly where they'll take her. Haruda agreed. Exactly. Anyways, since that means they have to actually get to the temple before they can do any sacrificing, they decided that we would have to slow them down somehow, Ace continued. Why not just get Mary now, before any of this happens? Haruda asked in confusion. Cause Marco said that everyone else is still restocking on the island, and if we make the people here mad we'll probably have to leave right away, Luffy piped in. Right. He wants to wait until nighttime to get Mary and go, that way everyone on the mobile be restocked and we can leave right away without worrying about the crazies in town chasing after us. Ace said, Haruda nodding again in understanding. So anyway, since we're waiting so long there's a possibility that they're gonna try and sacrifice her in the meantime. That's why we had to slow them down. Once the signal's shown, we're gonna get Mary and head straight to the Mobi. Ace said, looking to the sky and noticing that the sun was setting quickly. What signal are we looking for? Haruda asked, also looking to the sky. Don't know. Marco said he was gonna see if he could talk to Jozu before he left town, but Luffy and I left after that so we don't have a clue whether he managed to do it or not, Ace said with a shrug. They were walking into town now, the hustle and bustle of the morning now down to a few villagers milling around lazily. There seemed to be an energy to the town though, in anticipation, and they guessed it was because they were getting ready for a sacrifice. Alright, well now that I'm caught up, where are Marco and Sabou? Haruda asked, looking both ways as he tried deciding which way to head. This way, Luffy said confidently, and Haruda nearly missed as the boy discreetly sniffed the air in front of him before he changed his direction, heading off the opposite way into town than they had been going. Apparently that way. Ace said with a shrug as he turned to follow his brother. Haruda caught up quickly, still in slight amazement at Luffy's show of his heightened sense. It was still something he had to get used to. The three walked quietly, glancing around at the people and buildings as they went, and soon they found Sabou and Marco sitting on a bench talking quietly to each other. Hey, you guys. All good? Sabou asked as he looked to them. Luffy beamed at him, skipping over. Ace and I finished everything like you said, Luffy said proudly. Sabou nodded, smiling to his brother. Good. You're just in time. Declan just sent someone to get Mary. It seems that the sacrifice is about to start, Sabou said, and before anyone could question who Declan was, the door to the building a few buildings away opened. Two men came out with Mary in between them in chains as they dragged her out. She was crying again and begging to be spared, but none of them listened as they started dragging her off towards the town center. Behind them, the man who had been yelling at her, the one Luffy deemed as having a gray aura, walked out, a scowl on his face as he followed after them. Declan? Ace guessed as he pointed to the man. Sabou nodded, he and Marco standing as they all got ready to follow. The town center was once again crowded with people, all of them cheering as they saw Mary being dragged over. The pirates stood at the outskirts again, watching as they dragged Mary up the platform and over to the giant wooden cross, unchaining her and tying her up onto it. Ladies and gentlemen, in the name of Zenshana we shall rid ourselves of the non-believer, Declan announced, everyone cheering in response. They began chanting the word heretic over and over until Declan raised a hand, silencing them. Because we allowed such a heretic to live here with us, we must repent for our own sins. We must show Zenshana just how much we believe, how much we worship him, Declan shouted, garnering more cheers from the crowd. The only way to do so is sacrifice. In hopes of cleansing us from our sins, we must give the great Zenshana a sacrifice, and what better than the non-believer? Declan asked loudly. There were cheers and screams of agreement as the men from before, as well as a few more men, came and lifted the cross, laying it down before picking it up and rising it in the air. The cheers were deafening as Mary was carried down, still bound to the cross and sobbing. Declan followed, and behind him, the crowd followed, all heading off towards the temple in the woods. So, about that signal? Haruda asked, looking to Marco. It was one thing to wait when Mary wasn't being harmed, but now she was only a half hour away from being sacrificed. We'll keep waiting. If they make it to the temple before the signal's given, we'll get her and go regardless, yoi. Marco said with a frown as the group of pirates walked down an alley, out of the view of the crowd. They probably could have walked with the crowd without anyone noticing, but they didn't want to take the chance, not when these people seemed willing and ready to sacrifice anything they deemed went against their religion. The group of pirates made their way through the now empty, silent town and straight to the forest. Marco immediately transformed into his phoenix form and flew up ahead of the trees while Ace, Sabou, and Luffy all grabbed a branch and swung up into the trees as well, leaving Haruta on the ground. Alright, cool, I'll just activate my cool powers too and zip through the trees like an animal, Haruta mumbled as he grabbed a low-hanging branch, struggling to pull himself up into the tall tree. He heard a snicker and immediately remembered Sabou's hearing when the blonde's head popped in front of him, scaring him. To be fair, Ace and I aren't using any powers. We've just had a lot of practice, Sabou said, and without getting a chance to respond, two hands grabbed the back of Haruta's shirt and he was hoisted into the tree, looking at the three grinning brothers. There, now come on Ruta, we gotta catch up, Luffy said, immediately zipping off into the mess of trees ahead of them with Ace. Sabou laughed at the look on Haruta's face but stayed at his side. I'll help you. Come on, Sabou said, showing Haruta where to step and what branches to grab. Haruta had to admit that the brothers made it seem a whole lot easier than it was, and he was grateful Sabou hadn't saved him from falling out more than once. They had climbed pretty high up without the commander even noticing, but soon their heads were poking out and they were at the top of the tree, Ace and Luffy only a few trees away. A flash of blue landed on a tree in between the two groups and Marco turned back into a human, standing carefully on a branch. We're at Ace and Luffy's roadblock now. The crowd is still a couple minutes away, yoi. Marco said, everyone, turning to look at the path below them. I'll help Ruta get to the lower branches seeing as we're getting closer to the temple now, Sabou said, Marco nodding as the two disappeared into their tree. Lu, you head down too, just in case. I'll stay up here with Marco, Ace said, patting Luffy on the back. The boy nodded, also disappearing into the trees, leaving Marco and Ace alone at the top of the trees. So what's this signal gonna look like? Ace asked as he glanced around. You'll know when you see it, yoi, Marco said with a smile. Ace shrugged, settling comfortably on his branch. Alright, but if I miss it I blame you. If you see it just say it, Sabou will hear you, Ace said. Marco nodded and the two sat silently. Please, I'm a believer, I am. Please let me go, Mary cried as she struggled against the ropes tying her to the cross. No one listened to her, the chants of people calling her a heretic only growing louder. I'm a believer. I believe, Mary sobbed, forced to stare at the sky as she was carried through the woods, closer and closer to the temple. After being ignored again, Mary stopped yelling, merely resorting to crying silently and watching as more and more of the stars started shining in the sky. The moon was showing itself now too, big and bright. It was beautiful, and under better circumstances, she would probably find peace in it, but now it only filled her with dread. Heretic. Non-believer. Sacrifice. The shouting around her drowned out any semblance of peace she could even hope to have, and the tears blurred her vision again. Her wrists were sore from her struggling against the rope, and her midsection hurt as well from how tightly the ropes were tied around her middle. It was hard to breathe, but she didn't know if it was from all her crying or the ropes themselves. A flash of light in the sky caught her attention, and she briefly wondered if it had been a firework. Maybe the other town was having a festival? Oh, the irony. Heretic. Non-believer. Sacrifice. The chanting was cut off and screams of surprise were heard as there was a rustling from the trees. Mary turned her head, trying to see what was happening, but whatever it was already out of the trees and below her, making it impossible to see whatever it was. Outsider, leave now, Declan shouted, which led Mary to believe that it was a person. Sorry, no can do, you see, I don't mind people practicing religions they believe in. But once human sacrifice gets involved I become less inclined to let it go on any longer. A man's voice said. Declan made a noise as if he was about to say something but was stopped. A crash on the other side of the path drew Mary's attention and she saw a body fly into the trees. There were more screams and more rustles from the trees, and not for the first time, Mary wished she wasn't strung up on this cross so she could see what was happening. Of course, you should be careful what you wish for, because suddenly the cross was fallen, the men from the village who had been carrying it all running away from whatever was happening. She yelped, but was unable to do anything but lay there as she fell to the ground. The cross landed with a loud thump that shocked her, the wind getting knocked out of her from the impact. Now that she was on the ground, it was easier to see what was happening, and from the looks of it, there was a group of outsiders fighting off the villagers. Of course, it wasn't much of a fight, and most of the villagers were running back towards the village itself rather than fighting, but there were a few believers still there trying to fight back. Her attention was once again drawn away as a blue light caught her attention, and as she looked into the sky at it, she saw it grow closer. It almost looked like a bird, but what kind of bird was such a bright, luminescent blue? And, wait, was it on fire? She shrieked as the flaming blue bird dove towards her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away as she waited for the inevitable pain that was to come. It never came though, and instead, there was a gust of cool air and a feeling of relief as the ropes binding her to the cross slackened, slipping to the ground and freeing her. She blinked, her eyes open in shock just in time to watch the blue bird change into a human. Zenshana? She asked in disbelief, because what else could this be? A flaming blue bird turning into a human just wasn't possible. Obviously, it was an act of her god, one she had betrayed. Please, I believe, I'll never go against you again. I promise, she begged, hands clasped together as she pleaded. The man raised his hands up in a gesture of peace, and despite her tears and the fear inside her, she managed to stay in place as he grew closer to her. Don't worry, I'm not here to hurt you, and my name isn't Zenshana either, Yoi. The man said. Mary opened and closed her mouth in confusion, not sure what was happening. Come on, Yoi, don't be scared, I'm here to get you out of here, he said, holding his hand out. She hesitated, turning to look back to the fight and finding that there wasn't anyone left. All the men who had been fighting were now unconscious on the ground, and the group that had come from the trees were watching her. What? Who are you guys? She asked fearfully. Surely this was happening because she had sinned. Because she had gone against Zenshana. This had to be a trick or an act of the devil. We're a part of the Whitebeard pirates. Henry told us what happened and we promised him we'd help you out. One of the men said. Mary's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her brother. Henry? Is he alright? She asked, hoping they hadn't hurt him. They had said they were pirates, and everything she'd been taught about pirates hadn't been good. He's safe, but we really should get going. The town's coming back, and from the looks of it they brought weapons. One of the darker-haired men said, looking towards the town. Mary looked but saw no one and wondered if he was trying to trick her. Come on, you don't have to be scared anymore. Let's go, the smallest man said, a smile on his face as he bounced in place beside her. Still confused, Mary only nodded, standing and smoothing her dress down, ignoring how dirty the previously pristine white dress had been. Alright, let's go. It's a bit of a walk, but it seems we'll be running, so that should cut down the time a bit. Can you run? The blonde asked. Mary nodded, and before she knew it she was being dragged forward, forced to break into a sprint to keep up. Good. My name's Sabou, by the way. Those are my brothers Ace and Luffy, and those two are Marco and Ruta. The blonde, Sabou, introduced. She could only nod, still in a daze as she was dragged through the forest. This way, the smallest, Luffy, shouted as he began steering them off the path and further into the trees. Mary was confused as to where they were going, but everyone else seemed to trust him, so she guessed she had no choice but to do so as well. They all ran for what felt like an eternity, but soon they were running along a beach, the water lapping close to their feet. Wasn't the Moby at the other village? Ace asked. Yeah, but Marco had Jozu tell them to move it here. It's closer than where it was, so it's less of a run. Where is it, Lou? Sabou asked, and Luffy sniffed the air, pointing to what looked to lead to a cove. Over there, he shouted, steering them all in the right direction again. Growing closer, the Moby became more and more visible, and before Mary knew it, they were boarding the gissail. It had all happened so fast that she hadn't even registered any of it happening as she saw it, not until she heard her name being called and felt a small body ramming into hers. Henry? She asked in confusion, looking down and seeing her little brother crying as he hugged her. You're alright. Everyone here said you would be, but I didn't know if I should trust them, cause they said they were pirates, and didn't everyone else say pirates were bad guys and stuff? Henry asked. A bit too fast but still clear enough for her to hear. I think these pirates are good, she said, still a bit unsure herself as she looked around the ship. Haruto was panting beside her, sitting on the deck as he did and wiping sweat from his head. Ace, Sabou, and Luffy didn't seem to be all that bothered as they talked amongst themselves, Ace ruffling Luffy's hair as the two oldest smiled at the youngest, and Marco was watching them all with a small smile of his own. Really, Mr. Captain said that he could take us to a new island because everyone else was mad at us. Does that mean he wasn't lying? We can go somewhere else and you don't have to be sacrificed? Henry asked. Mary did her best to give her brother a smile but didn't know how well she managed it. I don't know, I guess we'll just have to find out, but I think it's safe to assume that I won't be sacrificed. Not tonight anyway. The next morning, the brothers sat beside Mary and Henry in the dining hall, watching as the green-haired girl slowly ate her food, still looking nervous. Henry had no such qualms as he ate quickly, a smile on his face as he did so. You don't have to be scared, Luffy suddenly said to Mary, shocking the poor girl. Excuse me? She asked, turning to look at the young teen. You don't have to be scared. Everyone here is really nice. We were really scared when we first came here too, but Whitebeard, and Marco, and Thatch, and Izo, and Jozu, and Ruta, and… I think she gets the point, Lou, Ace muttered as he ate a forkful of eggs. Oh, well, they're all really nice. They fed us, and gave us clothes, and kept us safe and stuff. They'll help you too, Luffy said, beaming at Mary, throwing her off guard. It took her a second to find her words again. Are you a part of the crew as well? She asked curiously. But we weren't always. Whitebeard and everyone saved us and helped us, and we just stayed. Luffy said, making Mary curious as to what they had needed saving from. What happened? She asked, realizing that maybe she had more in common with these three than she thought. After all, she had just been saved by the pirates as well just last night. We don't exactly like talking about that, sorry. Let's just say, we were kidnapped for a long time, and the Whitebeards helped us escape our captors, Sabou said, stumbling as he tried to find the right words. Mary only nodded, feeling sympathetic towards the brothers. She could only imagine how horrible it must have been, and if they weren't fond of sharing details, it was obviously a traumatic experience. Anyways, you'll be fine here. Besides, Jiru said that they called the mini-mobi closest to us and you'll be heading off after lunch. They'll take you to one of Whitebeard's islands. Ace said with an indifferent shrug as he finished his meal. Mary only nodded in response, turning back to her meal, noticing now that her brother wasn't with her. Henry? She asked, slightly frantic as she looked around the galley for him. He went out on deck. We can go get him for you if you want, Sabou said with a worried look in his eyes. Mary opened her mouth, hesitating again as she looked at her food. Would you mind? I'd rather he stay close, stay out of trouble, she said. Sabou smiled, shaking his head as he and Ace stood. It's no problem. I understand how it feels to be worried about your siblings causing trouble, Sabou said, earning shouts from Ace and Luffy as they tried defending themselves, causing Mary to smile. We'll send him in here shortly, Sabou said, ignoring the shouts as he left. Ace rolled his eyes and followed, while Luffy tilted his head, watching them go but not following. The two oldest stopped when they saw he wasn't following, but after a few seconds, they both shrugged and left the room, leaving Mary and Luffy sitting at the table. The young teen was swinging his feet and humming, a smile on his face as he did so. All the other commanders who had been at the table earlier had left, and with breakfast being nearly over, that left Mary and Luffy as one of the only two people in the galley. Feeling a bit awkward and still nervous, Mary tried focusing on her food. The sooner she finished, the sooner she could leave. I used to be really scared and stuff too. Especially of whiskey. Actually, I'm still a little scared of her, but I'm trying not to be, Luffy said suddenly, surprising Mary. Whiskey? Mary questioned, not knowing who that was. She hadn't really gotten anyone else's name, having gone straight to sleep last night. She's a nurse. Me and my brothers don't like nurses, they weren't nice to us, but the nurses here are nice, or at least I think they are. We're trying to not be scared of them, Luffy explained. Is it that obvious that I'm scared? Mary asked with a hesitant laugh, picking at her food with her food. Nope, Luffy said, confusing Mary, but suddenly she flushed. Had he tricked her, bluffed her into confessing she was scared? She felt a bit ashamed that she had been tricked so easily, but that feeling left when Luffy continued talking. I felt it, he said, his head tilting again as he looked at the table. Felt it? Mary asked, wondering what he meant by that. I could feel you were scared. You still kind of are, but now you're just confused and curious, Luffy said, turning to smile at her. How do you know that? Mary asked. Luffy opened his mouth to reply, but was cut off by a different voice. Our brother's an empath, Sabou suddenly said. Luffy's mouth closed as he and Mary both turned to look at the blonde. An empath? Mary asked. It means he can feel other people's emotions. Don't know how, it was just something he was born with, Sabou said with a shrug before turning. Anyway, we got Henry for you. He was watching the ocean, Sabou said, patting her brother on the back who smiled brightly to her. Conversation with Luffy forgotten. Mary turned a stern look to her brother. Henry, I told you to stay with me, she scolded, making Henry look to the floor sheepishly. Sorry, Mary, he mumbled. She rolled her eyes. It's fine this once, as long as you didn't cause trouble. Just don't do it again, alright? She asked. He nodded, sitting beside her on the bench. If you'll excuse us, we have an appointment. Come on Lou, time to talk to Whiskey, Sabou said, Luffy nodding and leaving the table. Mary was reminded of her conversation with Luffy and how he said he and his brothers were trying to get over their fear of whiskey. Bye Mary, bye Henry. See you later, the young teen called as he waved to them, exiting the galley. The siblings waved back to him as they watched him leave, and once he was gone, it was quiet. I like them, Henry said suddenly, shocking Mary. Really? Mary asked hesitantly. Henry nodded. Yeah, they've been really nice and stuff, the boy said, smiling cheerily. Mary frowned, turning back to her still unfinished food. Yeah, I guess they have been. I can't believe I missed all the action, again, the chef cried. Mary and Henry were sitting nearby the captain, not sure where else to go. Since they were so close to the giant though, they could hear the conversations happening between the commanders and the captain himself. Seems like a problem that none of us are suffering from, Haruta muttered from where he was cleaning his saber. Whitebeard smiled as he listened, drinking from his large sake cup. That's it, I'm sticking to the brothers like glue from now on, Thatch declared, earning a few laughs from the commanders and captain. Oh yeah, I'm sure they'll take that real well. We've only just started getting them comfortable here with us, but sure, go ahead and scare them off again, Thatch. Flamenco said with a smile, making the chef pout. I won't scare them off. We're buddies, they know I just want to have some fun too. I'm sure Sabou's listening right now and will agree, Thatch said, crossing his arms. That's definitely how it'll go, Namur said with an eye roll. It will? Where are they? I'll ask myself, Thatch declared. They're speaking with Whiskey-san, and you know no one's interrupting that. You'll just have to wait until they're finished. Whitebeard said with a smile to the man. Thatch groaned but nodded. Mark my words. The next time there's action, I'll be there for it, Thatch said as he stalked off, right towards where Mary and Henry were. His pout left his face as he spotted the two and was replaced with a smile. Ah, you two are the ones Marco, Haruta and the trio saved, right? He asked as he sat beside them. Yup, I'm Henry, Henry said with a smile. I'm Mary, Mary said with her own hesitant smile. Well, I'm Thatch. I'm the chef here. How are you two faring around here? He asked, watching the crew as he spoke. Just fine, thank you, Mary said politely. Thatch laughed. You remind me of Sabou. Well, pre-comfortable Sabou, Thatch said, more to himself. What does that mean? Mary Hatch blinked for a second. Oh, right, well the brothers weren't very, what's the word, open when they first arrived here. Sabou usually did all the talking for the three of them, and they didn't share much of anything about themselves. Luffy pretended he was mute at first, you know. Had us all fooled, Thatch said with a laugh, and Mary was reminded of the fact that Sabou had said they'd been kidnapped before they'd become pirates. Anyway, the way you talk and act, it's how Sabou acted. Before he got more comfortable here, that is. Thatch said. The three were quiet now, Henry looking to the sky instead of listening while Mary looked to the ground. You know, Sabou said that Luffy was an empath, that he feels other people's emotions. Is that true? Mary asked. Even though Luffy had basically confirmed it for her in the galley, it was still too hard to believe. Oh, he said that, huh? Well, yeah, it's true. A bit hard for us to believe too, you know, but after seeing him do his thing a few times, it gets more believable, Thatch said, rubbing the back of his head. Mary frowned. Now that we're out of our village, it's hard to believe just how secluded and cut off from the outside world we really were. Like devil fruits, and empaths, and pirates. We didn't know about any of those things. We were only taught how to please Zenshana and what not to do, Mary said, thinking back to her conversation with Marco about how he had turned into a flaming bird. Explains how none of the villagers recognized us then. We're pretty well known. Usually, the second someone sees Marco they know we're whitebeards, Thatch said, again, more to himself than to Mary. We don't get the newspaper, it was seen as an act against Zenshana. We weren't allowed to interact with outside ships, only Declan and a few of the people working in the market could. We couldn't go too far into the woods either or else we would be outcasted and shunned, Mary said, explaining how they knew nothing about pirates. Honestly, it's amazing you survived there, Thatch said with a whistle. With all the restrictions, he didn't think he would be able to last a day without breaking some kind of rule. Mary's mouth twitched upwards into a smile at the words, shrugging. We were all raised that way. It's easy not to give in to temptation when you don't know what you're missing out on, she said. Well, real world rule number 1, take everything the Marines say with a grain of salt. Real world rule number 2, not all pirates are as nice as us, we're a bit of an exception. Real world rule number 3, the fear of being sacrificed isn't something you have to worry about normally, Thatch said, ticking the rules off on his fingers. Mary smiled again, laughing a bit. I'll remember that. Thanks, she said. Thatch smiled to her, patting her shoulder. No problem. Now, if you'll excuse me, it seems the brothers are done speaking to Whiskey and I've got some pressing questions to ask them, Thatch said as he stood, jogging off toward the brothers who were walking down from the upper deck. Mary watched him leave with a smile, turning to look to Henry after a minute. Her brother seemed content to just watch the sky, a smile on his face as he did. Even though their life had been hard, she had nearly been killed, and their father had died, he seemed to be taking it all pretty well. Much better than she was anyhow. Maybe it hadn't all caught up to him yet. In any case, she would deal with it when it came, but for now, she would try and stay strong. Try and give these pirates a chance. They had saved her and Henry after all. Get them. Get the demon trio. Mary and Henry watched safely from Whitebeard's lap as the pirates fought against the Marines. Ace, Sabou, and Luffy were fighting in front of them, Marco close by, and a group of Marine soldiers charged forward, swords raised as they did. Demon trio? Henry asked, confused why they were calling the brothers that. It's a moniker the Marines gave the brothers, Whitebeard said as he watched his crew fight, careful eyes scanning over the entire thing. Why? Mary asked in equal confusion. The brothers seemed really nice, so why would they be titled such a horrible name? The brothers were involved in something that the Marines wanted to cover up, and in an attempt to shift the blame onto someone else, they labeled the brothers as the bad guys. Because of that, they were given the moniker the Demon Trio. Whitebeard explained with a frown. Ace, duck, Sabou shouted, The eldest doing just that without hesitation as Sabou swung his pipe where Ace's head had been, knocking a marine away as he did. "That's not right," Henry mumbled with a frown. Whitebeard smiled, laughing. "You're right, it's not, but that's how the world works, unfortunately," the captain said with a sigh. Mary frowned as well and remembered that's his first real-world rule. "Sabou," Ace called. The blonde nodded as he jumped backward, behind Ace. The raven-haired teen immediately threw his fist back, the hand igniting immediately as he threw a flaming punch forward, knocking away a few of the soldiers. "Leave some for me," Luffy called as he sprung over Ace's shoulders, fists raising as he punched rapidly, knocking away even more of the marines. Mary and Henry watched in awe as the entire crew fought. Clearly the victors already, even if there were still a few marines up. The crew was strong, only a handful of them actually injured, which said something when there were hundreds of them on board. Soon enough the marines were driven off the boat, the pirates cheering for their victory as they watched them go. Henry and Mary smiled as well, enjoying the cheerfulness of the pirates as they watched the marines run off. "Do you guys fight marines often?" Mary asked Whitebeard, immediately finding that it was a stupid question. They were pirates, of course they fought marines a lot, it's what they do. "Whenever they get overconfident enough to believe they can take us down, yes," Whitebeard said, his smile never leaving his face as he spoke to her. Mary smiled back before turning to face the crew again. Ace and Luffy were talking animatedly about something, and from the looks of it, it was pretty amazing if Luffy's hand gestures were anything to go on. Sabou was off to the side talking to Thatch, who kept switching his features from hopeful to pouting and then smiling. Whatever they were talking about though was interrupted when Marco walked over, pointing to Ace and Luffy who were now butting heads about something. Sabou sighed, pinching his nose as he stalked up to the two and knocked them both on the heads, the two falling into a squat as they rubbed their heads. "Ow, what was that for?" they asked simultaneously, looking at Sabou with looks of betrayal. The blonde rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest. "For being idiots. Like always," he said, the two pouting at his words. There was an immediate reaction as they tried to defend themselves, but Mary tuned it out, laughing instead. "They sure are energetic," she said, Henry nodding in agreement beside her. "Gararara, that they are. They weren't always like that though," Whitebeard said, his bright smile turning fond. "Oh yeah, I keep hearing bits and pieces about that," Mary said, remembering what everyone had told her about the three. "They used to be quite reserved, didn't really speak unless spoken to. It's only been the last few weeks that they've really opened up," Whitebeard said with a sigh as he took a sip from his cup. "Really, so soon?" Mary said in surprise, thinking that the brothers had been like this for a long time, not just a few weeks. "That's right. Those three have a long way to go to heal, but they've made fantastic progress," the captain said, smiling fondly once more. Mary turned to look at the bickering brothers, finding herself smiling and nodding in agreement. "It sure looks that way." It was just after lunch when Haruta came up from below deck, having left lunch early when he got word that they had a call. "Pops, they're here in an hour," Haruta reported, which Whitebeard nodded to. "Thank you, son," Whitebeard said, turning to look at Henry and Mary. "Seems your ride should be here shortly. They'll take you to the closest island under my protection and you'll be given a place to stay. You're welcome to stay there however long you want to," Whitebeard said to them. Mary's eyes welled with tears of gratitude, but they didn't fall. "Thank you. That's extremely kind of you," Mary said, wiping at her eyes as she said so. Whitebeard laughed. "Don't mention it, child. Hopefully, you and your brother will be able to lead happy lives now," Whitebeard said, to which Mary nodded too, hoping the same herself. She and Henry sat off to the side for the most of that next hour, not wanting to get in the way, especially now that they were being provided a home on one of these pirates-protected islands. Soon enough, the mini-mobi was in sight and was beside their ship, ready for them to board. "See you later, Mary," Henry, Luffy said with a bright smile as he waved, he and his brothers having walked over to say their farewells. The two smiled and waved back. "Goodbye. Thank you again for everything," Mary said as she and Henry boarded the mini-mobi. The Whitebeards waved their goodbyes to them, all shouting their well wishes as they did. And Mary felt a swell of joy in her chest as they did. It was nice to feel cared for, even if it was from a pirate crew she had only stayed with for less than a day. They had saved her after all. Getting acquainted on the Whitebeards Island was a lot easier than she had expected. She and Henry had been given a home to stay in and their neighbors had welcomed them with wide open arms, explaining how they ran things in their quiet village and places she could get work from if she needed it. Henry was also going to school, a real school, not one that censored everything to the point that you didn't know anything but your small town, and he was making friends. Mary smiled to herself as she walked to the market, basket in hand. People greeted her as she passed and she responded in kind before continuing on her way. It was a nice, bright, peaceful day, not a cloud in the sky. Birds chirped quietly from their trees and kids ran along the path, laughing and smiling as they did so. It was almost too good to be true, to go from living in nightmare one day to living in paradise the next. Passing by a newsstand, Mary paused to buy one of the papers. Ever since she learned there was a world outside of her small secluded town, she found herself wanting to learn everything she could about it. Thanking the man as she bought the paper, she looked at the front page, eyebrows raising as she saw 3 familiar faces right on the front cover. Oh, the demon trio found out? She asked herself, skimming the article. She smiled to herself, shaking her head as she opened the paper, 3 bounty posters inside. Rule number 1 of the real world. Take everything the Marines say with a grain of salt. It was a couple of days after they had parted ways with Mary and Henry. The brothers had officially been a part of the crew for a little over 2 months now, and the 3 were still amazed every day that they had gotten lucky enough to have stumbled upon one of the only friendly pirates in the world. Luffy definitely had some crazy good luck when it came down to it, that's for sure. Ace groaned when he felt Sabou slap his chest in an attempt to wake him up. 5 more minutes. Ace mumbled as he rolled over onto his side, facing away from the blonde. You have until Luffy's finished writing in his journal, Sabou grumbled out, just waking up himself. Sabou was woken up when Luffy had a nightmare, but he'd fallen asleep shortly after, only waking up when he heard breakfast finishing up in the galley. Luffy was sitting at the desk, tongue poking out as he concentrated on writing his nightmare down, and Sabou was still slightly amazed they had all stuck to writing in their journals. Already they had quite a few pages full of their writing, and Sabou wondered how long it would take to fill their entire journals. How much more you got, Lou? Sabou asked with a yawn as he sat up, stretching. Luffy's concentration broke, turning to look at Sabou. Not a lot. Almost done, he said, turning back to the book. Breakfast is ready so we can go once you're done and Ace is awake, Sabou said, Luffy nodding to show he heard him. The blonde got out of bed and started getting ready for the day, trying to tune out the sound of Ace's snoring as he did. When he was ready, he noticed Luffy seemed to be finishing up, so he picked up one of Ace's boots, chucking it at the sleeping teen. Ow. What was that for? Ace mumbled, rubbing the back of his head which had been nailed by the heel of the boot. Luffy snickered from the desk while Sabou rolled his eyes. Get ready, Ace, we're leaving, Sabou said as he crossed his arms over his chest. Ace grumbled about it, but did it anyways, sluggishly sliding out of bed and getting ready while Luffy finished writing, closing the book and putting it in the quill away. All good? Sabou asked, turning to assess whether Ace was awake enough to leave the room. I'm good, he said with another yawn, rubbing his eye as he did. Sabou shrugged, because even if Ace wasn't awake enough they wouldn't have to go outside until after breakfast, so his eyes shouldn't have too much of an issue until then. The 3 left their room and Sabou tilted his head once they did, picking up on the conversation in the galley. What? Ace asked him, knowing the look Sabou wore meant he was hearing something. I think there was something in the news about us, Sabou said with a frown. Ace and Luffy frowned now as well because that couldn't be good. What's it about? Luffy asked softly, but Sabou could only shrug. I don't know, but the commanders are wondering how we're going to take it, so odds are it's nothing good, Sabou said with a sigh. Couldn't they just live without the Marines trying to ruin their lives every day? Great, of course it's not. Ace mumbled with a scowl as he kicked his feet. The 3 walked silently, the anticipation of whatever they were about to find out stopping any more conversation from happening. Finally, they were walking into the galley, the 3 of them heading straight to their seats at the commander's table, already feeling the stares. So, what's the news? Sabou asked with a sigh, and the commanders looked momentarily confused before understanding shone on their faces, and Izo slid one of the papers towards trio huddled together, all trying to read the paper at the same time. The demon trio found out. Sabou mumbled to himself as he read the title, mind racing with different thoughts, all trying to figure out what that meant. The 3 read the article quickly, no one at the table speaking as they all watched the brothers. No one wanted to speak or interrupt them, so they merely ate silently, waiting to see how they reacted. Finally, they finished reading, sitting back as Sabou opened the paper to look at the bounties, each having gone up yet another 50 million for a grand total of 200 million. Now, along with their numbers, their names were plastered on the pages as well. So they found out our names then, Sabou said with a sigh as he studied their posters. His own didn't have a last name, and he silently wondered if his noble heritage had anything to do with that. Having the family name plastered alongside the number of an infamously feared teen would surely ruin his family's reputation, and he knew they would do anything to keep that from happening. Ace had been spared from a last name as well, and he was grateful for that. If they had seen the 4 letters spelling out the last name Ace despised, there would have been much more of an uproar than this. Luffy hadn't been as lucky, and his poster had his full name on it, Monkey D. Luffy, which led them to believe someone had made the connection between Garp and his grandson. How they had gotten any of their names in the first place was still a mystery though. Maybe there had been a few surviving Marines that had heard them during a fight, but other than that they had no clue, and probably would never know. Because of course, those bastards did. It was only a matter of time. Ace muttered bitterly, scowling. Sabou felt that it was too early in the morning to have to deal with all of this, but he didn't have the luxury of choosing when they got bad news. At least they won't call us by our numbers, Sabou said, trying to find any bright side to this. The brothers hated being called by their numbers, because every time they heard someone say them it flashed them right back to being in their cell. Listening to Haru list off names as he chose who was getting tested on that day. They began eating after that, normal chatter taking place as they did. The brothers were thankful none of the commanders pressed them anymore about it, and before they knew it, they were done with their meals, heading out onto the deck. Their sour moods didn't last all that long, not when they could freely go outside, look at the sky, bask in the sun, admire the ocean. No matter what happened to them, they could always rely on the sky and ocean to put them at peace. It had a calming effect on them, one that could soothe even their darkest thoughts. Of course, talking with whiskey was starting to have its benefits too. It wasn't too obvious yet, and they still needed a lot more help, but taking whiskey's advice was already beginning to seem like an option to them. Deep breaths. Remind yourself you're no longer in there. Tell yourself that you're safe here. That was still a difficult one for them. Focus on the now, not the then. It wasn't something they thought they'd need to use so soon, but now that they were, the three were glad they had kept up with the sessions. The deck slowly filled with people as time ticked away. After getting over the news, Ace, Sabou and Luffy had gone and joined the commanders sitting with Whitebeard, enjoying listening to them talk amongst each other. It was also something that helped them, to see others living so peacefully here, so calm and safe, almost normal. Nah, no way Ruda. You got to be lying about that one. Thatch said, shaking his head and crossing his arms, a look of doubt on his face as he looked at Haruda. 110% the truth, Thatch, Haruda said with a grin. So you want us to believe that you saw a dog talking? Like a human? And they weren't a mink? Jozu asked skeptically. Marco stood by with a bored look on his face, listening but not actively joining in on the conversation, while Izo was sewing as he listened and Atmos watched, invested in the conversation so far. Whitebeard was also watching with his usual fond smile, chuckling at his son's actions. Why wouldn't you believe me? I'm your brother after all, Haruda said with a hint of playfulness to his tone. Ace and Sabou listened on silently, eyebrows raised as they tried deciphering whether the commander was lying or not. It definitely sounded pretty adamant that it wasn't. In between them, Luffy laughed. He's lying. Luffy tapped to his brothers, not noticing Marco and Whitebeard's eyes flashing to him as they caught his taps. Oh yeah, I thought so. He's pretty good at it, Ace said genuinely, smiling now as well as he watched Haruda continue to try and convince the others he had really seen a talking dog. What did that first tap mean, son? I don't think you've taught it to me before, Whitebeard asked, his fond smile growing more playful as he took a sip of his drink. It was true that the brothers hadn't taught them the word for lying, but the context was easy to pick up on after what Ace had said. Luffy could feel the playfulness in Whitebeard and his smile widened, Ace and Sabou's as well. That one? Sabou asked, all of the other commanders stopping their conversation to watch as Sabou retapped the word for lying. Yes, that one, Whitebeard confirmed, trying to hold in his laughter as he did. It means lying, Luffy said cheerfully, laughing afterward. Whitebeard laughed as well and Marco smiled to himself, shaking his head while the commanders watched in interest. Lying? You think Ruda's lying too? See, even Luffy knows how ridiculous that story is, Thatch said with a grin, pointing to Haruda. I don't think so, I know so, Luffy said, head tilted as he continued smiling. This intrigued everyone once more as they looked at him. You do? How, Yoi? Marco asked, an eyebrow raised. I felt it. People don't have genuine feelings when they lie, Luffy said with a shrug as if it was common knowledge. So you know whenever anyone lies? Jozu asked in amazement. Luffy nodded in confirmation, grinning toothily. I hate Thatch's cooking, Haruda said, eyes slightly narrowed. Thatch gawked at his brother, a look of hurt on his face, but before he could speak Luffy laughed. Liar, Luffy said happily. I have 3 books in my room right now, Atmos said experimentally, interested in whether Luffy could really tell truth from lies just from how they felt. Liar, Luffy chirped in response. I have an entire bag of candy hidden somewhere on the ship, Jozu said confidently, grinning. Truth, Luffy said with another laugh, the commanders looking at Jozu who shrugged. He's right, he said, not even explaining why he had a hidden bag of candy. I love drawing, Izo said, more for the fun of it. He believed Luffy was telling the truth, but it was still amazing to see him use the powers they didn't know much about. True, Luffy said, seemingly having a good time. I won the snowball fight between Jiru and I last year, Thatch said confidently, feeling that this would stump Luffy. True, the boy chirped easily, causing Thatch to wilt. Everyone turned to Marco who looked back, eyebrow raised. What? He asked, not liking the expectant look they all had in their eyes. Your turn, Atmos said with a shrug as if it were obvious. Why? I believe him, Yoi. Marco said. Yeah, but if anyone can trick someone it would be you. Marco. You're good at that stuff. Haruda said, everyone, nodding in agreement. Ace and Sabou continued to watch on, enjoying the entertainment being provided to them. Whitebeard seemed to share their sentiment as he continued sipping from his drink, still grinning. Fine, Yoi. These guys are all idiots, Marco said, jetting his thumb over his shoulder to point at the group of commanders. They all gave shouts at that, but Luffy's laugh once again stopped them from speaking. Lies, Luffy declared, shocking them. Lies? So, we're not idiots? Jozu asked. But you sure as hell act like him, Yoi, Marco said with an eye roll, confirming that Luffy had gotten it correct. Amazing. Luffy, that ability of yours could tell us once and for all if Thatch is telling the truth whenever he tells his crazy stories, Haruta said, stars in his eyes as he said this. Thatch began trying to stop Haruta from this line of conversation while Izo looked to Ace and Sabou. Can you guys lie to Luffy? He asked curiously. They knew Luffy's powers almost as well as their own, so it was a good question to ask. If anyone knew how to lie to the boy, it would be them. This stopped Thatch and Haruta's argument as they turned to the two brothers. Us? No way, he always knows, Ace said, smashing Luffy's hat on his brother's head. Yeah, not even we are immune to his lie detection, Sabou said with a shake of his head, smiling. She, you always feel guilty whenever you lie to me. You guys are the easiest to tell if you're lying, Luffy said, making the two flush a bit at his words. So it's not always the same feeling. Like, you can't just feel a lie? Jozu asked, not quite sure how to word the question. Nope. Sometimes people feel guilty, or they feel ashamed, or they feel confident and stuff, but it's stronger or weaker depending on the situation. Marco was the hardest to tell, but it was still easy, Luffy said as he tried describing the things he felt in 2 words. Everyone seemed to understand that it was hard to explain and left it at that. Thatch was quick to turn back to Haruta and exclaim that he had known all along his story had been a lie, a smile on his face as he said so. The brothers watched with smiles once more, still amazed that the pirates could hear them talk about their powers and not call them monsters or turn them back into the Marines. More and more, these pirates proved to them that they were trustworthy, and maybe even safe. Alright you 3, you're up, Thatch announced as he walked over to them, long strides reaching the lounging brothers within seconds, a smile lighting up his face. Up, for what? Ace asked in confusion, eyes cracking open in confusion as he sat up away from the railing. Sabou and Luffy turned their heads in equal confusion, both having no idea what the chef could be talking about. Helping me out in the kitchen of course. I've got a baking list that a mile long and everyone else in my division is working on the feast, so I thought I'd ask you to help me out again, Thatch said, alluding to when they had helped him bake a while back. Luffy beamed at the memory, nodding his head happily as he spun to get off the railing, Sabou following as he smiled as well. I want to help, it was really fun last time, Luffy said excitedly, fists in the air in excitement. Exactly, now come on, we have to get cooking if we want to be done in time, Thatch said as he raised his fists as well, leading the way to the kitchen. Luffy cheered, Sabou laughed, and Ace shook his head, smiling, but they all followed willingly to the kitchen. So there's going to be a feast tonight? Sabou asked, remembering Thatch's earlier words. That's right. We're celebrating today after Namor's division managed to successfully protect one of our islands, Thatch explained as they walked. Is there gonna be a party? Luffy asked, thinking back to the party they had thrown when the brothers had joined. Thatch's smile widened as he nodded. You bet there'll be a party. If there's one thing the Whitebeards are good at, it's partying, Thatch stated proudly. They entered the kitchen, all of the chefs bustling around in a hurry as they began preparations for dinner which would begin in a few hours. They walked past them all and headed to the back like last time, Thatch telling the brothers to go ahead while he grabbed some ingredients that they would need. Luffy sat on one of the big tables, swinging his legs back and forth as he watched the chefs work, a smile on his face and stomach growling as he smelled the delicious aromas engulfing him. Ace was in a similar predicament because enhanced smelling or not, he could smell some of the stronger scents of food wafting his way, making his stomach growl as he leaned against the table Luffy sat on. Sabou rolled his eyes and shook his head at his predictable brothers, but smiled as he stood near them as well, turning to look at the chefs as well and watching them run back and forth, grabbing or cooking things. I'm back, now, first things first, Wash said, rolling his sleeves up and smiling after he set down the armful of ingredients he had brought over. The brothers all nodded and headed to the sink, Sabou stopping the brothers from starting another water fight in the process. When they returned, Thatch had already set out bread and dips for Ace and Luffy and had separated ingredients into 3 piles based on who was doing what. Luffy, why don't we work on cupcakes this time? Sabou, you've got pies, and Ace, you're on cookies, Thatch announced, handing them sheets of paper with recipes on them. Those are my top secret recipes, so don't go giving them to anyone else, got it? The chef asked them with a wink. They smiled, promising not to as they headed off, trusting Thatch with Luffy. Like last time, the group of 4 worked efficiently to get all the baked goods done on time. With the breads to distract them, Ace and Luffy didn't eat any of the uncooked desserts, and with Thatch's guidance, they were all able to get what needed to be done. As the hours passed and the desserts baked, the 4 shared stories, laughed, and generally had a good time. These were the times that the brothers had been hoping for. After 7 years in hell, this is exactly what they had been wishing for after escaping. This peace, this familiarity, this normalcy, this warmth. If they could continue having good times like this forever, it just might make up for all the damage that had been done to them. It's alright Ace, it's just a dream, a nightmare. Sabou soothed, trying to wake Ace from whatever horrible dream he was having. The eldest was thrashing, a look of discomfort on his face as he shook his head back and forth. Luffy sat by his brother, frowning in worry as he counted out how long he was stuck. All you have to do is wake up, open your eyes. Everything's alright. We're all safe. Sabou continued, grabbing Ace's hand that had swung right for him and placing it at his brother's side again. No one's going to hurt you. He tried again. Luffy's nose twitched and Sabou's ears pricked up, both using their senses as they noticed Marco heading towards their room. Can you take over Lu? Sabou asked the youngest, earning a nod from the boy. Sabou stood, heading to the door while Luffy began mumbling to Ace, repeating the simple phrases over and over in hopes that it would wake their sleeping brother. Marco's footsteps, in the meanwhile, grew closer and closer until he was right outside their door. He stopped, and Sabou anticipated the knock that came, swinging the door open before the commander could knock a second time. Marco, he greeted with a tenser smile than usual. Sabou. Everything alright, Yoi? Marco asked, a hint of concern in his voice as he noticed the blonde's demeanor. Behind him, Sabou heard Luffy continuing to coax Ace out of his sleep, but it didn't seem to be having any effect. Ace is stuck is all. He should be up soon, it's already been. He trailed off, trying to think back to how long Ace had been in his nightmare. 14 minutes. Luffy's voice piped up, loud enough for Marco to hear before it quieted to low mumbles again. 14 minutes. They don't normally last longer than 15, 20 max, Sabou said, his tense smile returning. I see, Yoi. Well, the crew members on watch said they might be seeing some ships in the distance, about 2 or 3 from the sounds of it. I was wondering if Ace could check if they were pirates or not, in case they might want to fight, Yoi. Marco said, his worry still obvious. When he wakes up, a sudden, loud gasp behind him had Sabou turning, allowing Marco a view of inside the room where Ace was sitting up, panting with wild eyes. Luffy, who had backed up to give Ace some space, moved toward him again, holding his hand while Sabou turned back to Marco, blocking the view again. We'll be out soon, he said, his smile laxer now, relief showing on his features while Marco nodded, thanking him before he left. What's going on? Ace asked, having noticed Marco in the doorway. Watchmen think there are a couple of ships heading our way and Marco wanted to know if you could check them out. Tell them if they're pirates or not. Sabou explained, sitting at the foot of the bed while he watched Ace. The eldest nodded, running his fingers through his hair, grimacing at how slick and greasy it felt from his sweat. Sure, I need a bath after though, he said, Sabou, laughing while Luffy smiled. Honestly, we all do. Maybe we should hold off until after we find out if they're pirates or not though. No good getting clean if we're just going to get sweaty again from fighting, Sabou said. Ace nodded his agreement, getting out of the bed and heading to the desk to grab his journal before thinking better of it. The crew needed to know if these were enemies or not, so he would just have to wait until after he'd identified them to write. Let's go, Ace said. Sabou frowned, noticing Ace wasn't getting his journal like he seemed to have been doing at first. Not going to write? He asked as he stood, Luffy grabbing his hat off the nightstand as he listened. I will after. It would be better to find out who the ships are first, Ace said with a shrug. Sabou seemed to accept the answer though, nodding. What about your senses? We should stay here for another minute. It'd be no good walking out and blinding yourself because you're not awake enough, Sabou said, referring to their heightened senses that got overwhelmed easily after waking up. Ace grumbled, forgetting about that. Fine, I'll write for a minute and then we'll go, he said, sitting in the chair and pulling out his journal. Sabou rolled his eyes but turned to Luffy who was twirling his hat between his hands. How'd you sleep, Luffy? Sabou asked his brother, moving to sit on the bed while he waited for Ace. Luffy looked at him, a smile plastered pleasantly on his face. Great, I didn't even have a single nightmare last night, Luffy responded cheerily, Sabou's eyebrows raising. Really, that's good, he said honestly. It was rare that any of them had a night where they only had a nightmare or two, but to have none at all was a blessing they hadn't had the luxury of having lately. Sabou and Luffy chatted for another minute, waiting until Ace was finished so they could head out on deck. It didn't take too long, and soon Ace was opening their desk drawer, placing his journal back inside before standing and stretching his arms. They're done. Can we go now? Ace asked Sabou as if he needed permission. Sabou rolled his eyes but nodded, standing. Yes, we can go now. He relented. Ace grinned along with Luffy as they both headed to the door, ready to go out on the deck. What's got you so excited anyways, Ace? Sabou asked, noticing Ace's eagerness to go identify the ships. A fight, what else? If these are pirates looking for a fight, it's probably gonna be a good one if there's more than one ship. Even if it's Marines, that just makes it all the better, Ace said, grinning at the thought of being able to fight Marines. He hated them with a passion, just as much as Sabo and Luffy did, and as much as they wanted to avoid them, they wouldn't pass up fighting them either. If it is going to be a fight, you better be careful. We haven't fought big groups like this before. Sabo warned, not wanting anyone to get hurt, though that was inevitable when it came to fighting. It's not any different from fighting small groups. It's just more people, Ace said with a shrug as they walked out onto the deck. Ace narrowed in on where Marco stood with Whitebeard and headed their way, his brothers following behind him. Soon the two spotted the brothers as well and Marco began heading their way. I'm glad you're alright, Ace, Yoi, Marco said with a smile, reminding the eldest that he had been trapped in a nightmare when Marco came by earlier. Gonna take more than stupid nightmares to keep me down, he said with a nonchalant shrug. Even though being stuck in nightmares sucked a ton more than just having normal nightmares, he wasn't going to show anyone how truly bothered he was by it. Besides, he was trying his best to ignore the residual fear and anxiety that he felt from the nightmare. So where'd they see the ships? Ace asked in an attempt to change the subject, looking over the railings, trying his best to spot wherever they were. Over here. They're still too far for our telescopes, but they're close enough to see that there's more than one, Yoi, Marco said, walking over to the railing and pointing off in a direction. Ace walked up beside him and peered into the distance, spotting the ships immediately. Oh, yeah, I see him. There's 3 ships. The one in front's bigger, but all of them have the same Jolly Roger, so they're definitely pirates. It looks like the usual skull and crossbones, but there's something around it. Like bubbles or something. Bubbles with bubbles in him, Ace said, trying his best to describe what he was seeing to those who couldn't. Bubbles with bubbles? Jiru asked, having been nearby. It's the best way I can explain it, Ace said with a shrug, turning to look to the commanders and Whitebeard. You think you could draw a picture of it? Marco asks, Ace nodding. Yeah, definitely. A fight it is then, Thatch said with an excited grin. And after I just got freshened up, Izo said with a sigh, waving himself off with one of his many fans. At least you didn't just get back from fighting a bunch of upstart rookies, Flamenco moaned, having just got back recently from Vision. In any case, there's 3 ships, so even if they're weak, they have numbers. If they're strong, they have the potential to put up a hell of a fight, Vista said, twirling his mustache. Which is why it's a good thing Ace here was able to identify them so soon for us so he could get prepared, Rikuyo said, patting Ace on the back. The teen smiled, unsure how to take the praise, while Sabo and Luffy both snickered at their brother's obvious discomfort. All we can do for now is get ready, seeing as they'll be here soon. You all should go warn your divisions and get your weapons ready, Whitebeard said, the commanders nodding before heading off to do just that. The brothers stayed with the captain, deciding it was the best place for them if they wanted to stay out of the way. They watched patiently as the crew got themselves ready for the upcoming fight, Sabo relaying to the captain and commanders that the pirates heading their way were definitely looking for a fight. Soon enough, everyone was ready and waiting for the pirates, ones Haruta identified as the Sea Terrors after he saw the flag Ace redrew for them. He also knew that the captain had a devil fruit, but was unaware as to which fruit it was. Apparently, anyone the crew fought didn't live to tell the tale, except for one sole survivor who had spread the rumor of the captain having a fruit. Once the ships were close enough, it was a flurry of action as cannons were fired, pirates boarded the Moby, and vice versa, with the Whitebeards boarding the enemy ships. The brothers were told they could stay near Thatch during this fight so that Marco could fly over the enemy's ships and make sure everything went smoothly there, ready to help anyone in case they needed it. Even though the pirates trusted the brothers' ability to defend themselves, it was more for everyone's peace of mind that a commander stay near the trio. The fight was going well so far, the Whitebeards, as usual, on the offensive and winning. As predicted, it was a tougher fight than any of the others they had had lately, many actually putting up a sweat as they fought. The trio of brothers were in their normal formation, each watching another's back and trusting that their own was being watched as well. They tore through crowds of pirates with practiced ease, smiling gleefully as they did. Of course, they were recognized as the Demon Trio quickly, which attracted more of the pirates' attention, all wanting their bounty. It didn't matter though, as they continued burning, stretching, and knocking pirates out with pipes, enjoying it all the while as they did. The fight was coming to a close, many pirates still standing, but not at their full stamina after the half hour that this fight had already lasted. Ace had just knocked out yet another pirate thug that thought he would be an easy target when he spotted another one of the Whitebeards about to be attacked. The man was already fighting 3 enemies in the front, and from behind the enemy captain was sneaking up on him, a malicious grin on his face as his hand began to glow, most likely from his devil fruit. Without thinking, Ace flung himself towards his fellow crewmate, knocking them out of the way of the captain. However, in the process, he ended up taking the attack full force. He heard Sabo and Luffy shout his name, he saw the enemy captain's surprise as he took the attack, and then, everything burned, which was odd seeing as he was fire, and then it went black. At least he saved his crewmate. Ace, Sabo and Luffy shouted, watching as the enemy captain used his attack on Ace rather than the man he had first intended it to be used on. The two flew into action immediately, Sabo swinging his pipe into the captain's head, making the man fly back into the railing while Luffy rushed over to Ace. As he did, he checked on his brother's wave, trying to assess how bad the damage was, and was confused, and a slight bit terrified, to find the wave flickering in and out of his vision. For a second he wondered if his powers were being a bit wonky, but after checking Sabou's and seeing the bright, opaque yellow wave, he figured it had something to do with Ace himself. That couldn't be good. Kneeling beside his brother, who was unconscious on the deck, he felt for a heartbeat, finding it quickly. There didn't look to be any injuries, but that didn't explain why he was unconscious or why his wave was flickering like that. Sabou joined him shortly after, and Luffy realized Thatch was pinning the enemy captain to the ground, another crewmate from Thatch's division running up and cuffing the captain. The fight was dwindling down around them, and when he drew his attention back to Ace, he realized that his brother seemed to be shrinking. He blinked a few times, looking to Sabou, who looked just as confused and scared as he felt. "What happened?" Izo asked as he came over, his own eyes full of confusion as he watched their brother get smaller and smaller. He jumped in front of an attack because he's a suicidal idiot and now he's shrinking. "I think it's got to do with whatever that guy's devil fruit is," Sabou said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder to where Thatch was questioning the enemy captain, glancing worriedly in Ace's direction every few seconds. "Is there anything else wrong? Besides the whole shrinking thing?" Izo asked, looking over Ace's chest for any sign of injury. "Other than being unconscious, I don't think so," Sabou said. The enemy crew was taken care of now, all of them either in the sea or on their battered ships as they left there, obviously captured, captain behind. "What's happening?" Marco asked as he changed back into his human form, landing lightly in between Ace and the enemy captain. Izo told him what was happening while nurses began rushing on deck, helping the injured to the infirmary. Whiskey's familiar face began heading their way, concern in her eyes as she saw the crowd around Ace. "His waves flickering," Luffy said as the nurse reached them, having been watching it this entire time in fear that it would disappear completely. "Flickering? Has it done that before, Yoi?" Marco asked, both Luffy and Sabou shaking their heads. "No, it keeps disappearing and then coming back in flashes. It's not getting see-through though," Luffy said, implying that Ace was in good health despite everything. Their once tall 17-year-old brother had now shrunk down to what looked to be when he was in his earlier teens, maybe from the age range of 12 to 15. The rest of the commanders were here now, and Whitebeard was only a few feet away, able to see and hear everything. "What fruit do you have?" Thatch asked from where he was still pinning down the enemy captain, who seemed too scared not to answer. "I have the sabou no mi," he stuttered out, everyone's attention turning to him, wanting to know what he had done to Ace. "The cell fruit? What's that got to do with Ace shrinking?" Izo asked with an angry frown as he walked over to the man, crouching down to look him in the eye. "I have the power to manipulate cells, and with it, I seek and regress them to exactly how they were years ago. When cells regrow, they grow with new information, and when I regress them back, it's as if they're at the point in their life when their cells had less knowledge. They don't have the same knowledge that the mature cells had, thus, the body reverts back to how it was at the point in time, matching the point in time the cells are at. The brain loses the information it gained, and all they remember is whatever they already knew when they were living with those cells," he explained shakily, practically trembling in Thatch's hold. Everyone shared looks of confusion, not quite following the man's explanation. "Alright, that hurt my brain trying to follow that," Blenheim moaned, rubbing his temple. Whiskey frowned as well, following the explanation better than the others and not liking what she heard as she gave Ace a checkup. "So in simple terms, you regressed Ace's cells back to when he was a young teen, and now whatever he knew back then?" she asked after deducing nothing was seriously wrong at the moment with him. She did hear something in his lungs though that she didn't like a fluid. "Exactly," the captain affirmed with wide eyes, nodding, hoping if he cooperated he would be spared. "And how do we change him back?" Sabou asked with a scowl. Because the more the man spoke, the worse the news got. Luffy seemed to understand just as much as he did how bad it would be if Ace, a possible preteen at the moment, only remembered being in the facility and suddenly woke up to find himself surrounded by people he didn't know. "Oh, I can't do that," the captain deadpanned. What do you mean, you can't do that?" Thatch asked, shaking the man a bit in anger. "It means, unless you want him to lose all of his memories from after he was that age, I can't do that. Regrowing cells is much different than regressing them. I would need to know exactly how they were when I regressed them, and last I checked, he jumped in front of my attack that was meant for someone else. I didn't exactly take the time to remember what information had been stored," the captain defended, only getting glares in response. "Does that mean he's stuck like this forever? Has to relive his life from this point?" Sabou asked, trying to keep his own anger in check, not wanting to influence Luffy, who already had to manage all of the commander's anger. Whitebeard watched from his chair with a frown of his own, hands gripping tightly to the arms of his chair. "No, I may be able to regress cells, but that doesn't mean it stays that way forever. If it did, that would be the key to immortality right there. No, it'll last an indeterminate amount of time, anywhere from a few days to a few weeks. The body will For lack of a better term, go through a dramatic growth spurt and then, boom, you'll have your friend back just the way he was. The captain said in a rush, trying to save himself as best he could. So what you're saying is you're useless to us now, Yoi, Marco said with an arched eyebrow, many of the commanders smiling as they caught on to Marco's words. Why yes. The man admitted hesitantly, not liking the looks. Alright. Thatch, go ahead. Marco said with a wave of his hand, Thatch grinning as he lifted the man up. The enemy captain began blubbering, but Thatch shoved him over the railing without another word, all of them hearing the distant splash as he hit the water. Asshole, Namur muttered, many nodding in agreement. Sabou and Luffy shared a look before turning to Ace. Whiskey was finished looking him over, turning to look at everyone. I don't know how, but he's got fluid in his lungs which I don't like, and his heart rate is skyrocketing. It's almost as if he was drowning, or is in the process of drowning, Whiskey said to them. How? That ass captain only said he's basically de-aged, nothing about drowning, Rikuyo said. Sabou and Luffy's frown deepened. He said he regressed his cells though, that the body is using past information to constitute itself right now. At this point in Ace's life, he was in the facility, a place where they did a number of tests to us. Sabou muttered darkly, already thinking of a few tests the doctors had done involving water and drowning. That's right, I forgot. Does that mean he won't remember us? Haruta asked. Most likely. When he wakes up, you guys shouldn't be close. We don't know what powers he has yet, and I'd rather he not attempt to fight you all thinking you're doctors or something. Sabou said while Luffy held their brother's hand. Sabou couldn't give any more warnings though before Ace groaned, eyebrows slanting in what looked to be pain. And then he gasped, shooting upright. Ace coughed and sputtered while Sabou rubbed his back gently, worry creasing his brows. Luffy sat beside them, holding on tightly to Ace's hand while he gagged, water coming out as he did and tears pricking his eyes. Ace, you alright? Sabou asked hesitantly. Those damn bastards. No one can hold their breath for 5 minutes. Ace growled out as he coughed up more water, the tears falling as his nose and throat burned. What happened? Sabou asked, trying to get information from Ace before he realized something was up and inevitably closed up. The damn doctors thought it'd be a good idea to see if Luffy and I could hold our breath in these stupid tanks for 5 minutes, that's what. Ace said bitterly, wiping his tears away harshly as he did and blinking a few times, trying to rid them from his eyes. Wait, where's Luffy? Is he okay? Ace asked in a slight panic, looking up fully now and noticing everyone surrounding him. His eyes widened, taking in everything from the plethora of pirates surrounding them, to Sabou and Luffy, who looked taller and different than he remembered, sitting on either side of him, to the fact that he wasn't in his cell anymore, to the lack of cuffs on his wrists, and then finally, to the sun, the sky, the clouds, and even the ocean. Where are we? What's going on? He asked, voice going low and dangerous, a scowl forming quickly. Was this another test? He had no clue, but he wasn't going to let anyone here hurt him or his brothers if he could help it. Ace, calm down, it's alright, we're safe. Sabou tried soothing, Luffy nodding beside him. Ace didn't speak for a second as he turned to look at Sabou, and then Luffy, skepticism in his eyes as he did. Something was wrong here, and if he didn't know any better, he would say that his two brothers looked older. He scooted a bit away from them just to be safe. Are you really Sabou and Luffy? He asked, using their more expressive silent language. The one they had first created before they had to modify it for Ace and Luffy who didn't have access to moving their hands thanks to their cuffs. We are. Luffy answered back with ease. It may have been a long time since they had used this version of their language, but it was like riding a bike. Once you knew it, no matter how long in between using it, you would still know it. Then why do you look different? Ace asked, hands making gestures that the pirates couldn't understand. They have two secret languages, Haruta asked in a surprised whisper to the other commanders who shrugged. None of them recognized the signing and gestures the brothers were using as anything they'd taught them. There were no taps, just gestures with their hands, from Ace flicking his fingers, to pointing to his eyes, and even miming a, what seemed to be, hat at one point. That's kind of hard to explain. Ace, how old are you? Sabou asked, still trying to find the best way to explain everything to his brother. How do you not know? You're the same age or at least normal you is. Ace said, eyeing Sabou again wearily. Humor me. Sabou said with a roll of his eyes. Ace watched him again for a minute, eyes flickering to Luffy as well, before responding. 14. He eventually signed, Sabou and Luffy both frowning at that. Great, Sabou said with a sigh, confusing everyone watching. Can you tell me what the hell's happening now? Is this another stupid test? Ace asked, eyes narrowing on the pirates again. No, it's not a test, Ace. We're not in the facility anymore, Sabou said carefully, watching his brother as he spoke. We're not, he asked. Even though they obviously weren't, it was still hard for him to believe. No, we're on a pirate ship. The Whitebeards, Luffy cut in with a bright grin, surprising Ace momentarily. The Whitebeard ship. I know this might be a bit hard to believe, but trust me when I say that Luffy and I, we're 3 years older than you remember. Sabou said, only getting a skeptical look from Ace which he expected. 3 years older? And you're trying to tell me this isn't another test? Ace asked, obviously not believing his brother. Why don't we go somewhere more private for this discussion, Whitebeard asked, drawing Ace's attention. His eyes widened at the size of the captain, but Sabou and Luffy didn't even flinch as they looked at the man, both looking relieved and nodding in agreement with him. What the hell was going on? Come on Ace, don't worry, no one here is going to hurt us, Sabou said, standing along with Luffy. Still hesitant, Ace slowly got up as well, wincing at the burning and strain in his chest that he still felt from nearly drowning. He watched as some of the people near the giant man headed off inside that he was on a ship, right? Ship. Another giving orders to the rest of the people around them as they did, and these weren't doctors? His eyes flickered briefly to a woman standing nearby, looking at him with worry but not making any moves towards him. He noticed the nurse's cap on her head though, and immediately felt his skin prickle at being near the nurse. Don't worry Ace, she's nice, her name's Whiskey, Luffy chirped beside him, grabbing his hand tightly in his own. Ace turned to look at Luffy with a raised eyebrow, showing just how little he believed that statement. Luffy pouted. It's true, she's helped us a lot, and I like her, even if she is a little scary to me still. Luffy said defiantly, although mumbling the last bit. Ace frowned but didn't say anything as he followed his brothers into the ship, the giant getting up behind them and following. His skin practically itched at all the stairs, all the people, the nurse, and now the giant behind them. Sabou and Luffy seemed fine, save for the pensive look on Sabou's face, but they weren't reacting at all the way Ace had been expecting them to. Which once again begged the question, what the hell was happening here? Soon enough they were all sitting in a room with a big table that had snails sitting on it, the giant at one end, the brothers on the other. Can someone tell me what's happening now? Ace asked, still inclined to believe that this was all another one of the facility's tests. Yes, it would have to be extremely elaborate, but he wouldn't put it past them to create something like this. Oh, or he was dreaming. Maybe hallucinating. He had been drowning what felt like minutes ago now, so it was possible he had actually just passed out and was now having some crazy dream. Ace, me and Luffy are 3 years older than you remember. I'm 17 and Luffy's 14. Sabou said, a little too calmly for his liking. Yeah, you said that before, but that doesn't mean it makes sense. Ace said, arms crossed over his chest as he frowned. It may sound crazy, but well, a few minutes ago, you were 17 too, Sabou said. Ace stared at Sabou, no expression on his face as he did. Right. Really, what did the doctors give you? Ace asked, still no expression. I'm serious Ace. As I said, it's kind of difficult to explain and crazy to hear, but you were 17. We've been here with the Whitebeards for 2 months, almost 3 now. They helped us escape from the facility, which we had been in for 7 years. Sabou said, gesturing to the pirates as he spoke. Luffy shifted in the chair beside him, but Ace didn't pay him much mind, focusing all of his attention on Sabou. And how does that explain the fact that I'm definitely not 17 and I've only been in the facility 4 years now? Ace growled out, thinking more and more that this was a test, and if that was the case, he wasn't going to make it easy for these bastards to get whatever result they wanted. We were just in a fight with other pirates, and one of them had a devil fruit. His ability allowed him to revert your cells how they were years ago. In simple terms, he de-aged you and in the process, you lost all of your memories from the years you lost, Sabou explained. Ace hummed, still clearly not believing. Sabou sighed, rubbing his temple. Ace, I'm telling you the truth. What do you want me to say? That this is Ace not? Sabou said with a hint of exasperation. We were in the tanks, right? Luffy asked suddenly, confusing everyone in the room. Tanks? Kindu asked, looking to Jiru who shrugged. And Haru. He wanted us to hold our breath. 5 minutes. Luffy said, eyes on his hands which were resting in his lap. And they dunked us over and over and over and over and Sabou stopped the youngest's rambling, reaching over and putting his hand on Luffy's. Ace was frowning, watching Luffy as he spoke, but not saying anything in return. But then we finally do it and they let us go back to our cell, but we had to wear the cuffs all the time, so we can't move our hands easy to make the signs anymore. Sabou says we should change it to taps, so that it's easier for us to talk with each other. Luffy continues, looking up and watching Ace now. And he says that this could mean explosion, and you think it's stupid, Luffy says, flicking his fingers, and Sabou's frown deepens, remembering exactly what happened next as well. Ace watched and had to admit that that sounded like him. And we start doing a few more, and then there's a loud noise, and it smells bad, and Sabou can't really hear anymore cause the boom was really loud, and everyone's screaming, and you look down the hall, and then there's the fire. Luffy's voice grows soft, eyes distant as he turns to look at the table, as if he was back in his cell, watching the glow of the flames get brighter and brighter as they grew closer, the heat slowly becoming suffocating. And it gets to our cell, but we're in cuffs and locked in, so we go to the corner, and then you say it's gonna be okay and that you're not gonna let a fire kill us after 4 years, and then the fire's in our cell, and you go in it, and Sabou's holding you really tight. But the fire doesn't hurt us, and we sit there for a really long time, but we don't move, cause we don't want the fire to start hurting us. But then the fire's finally gone, and you're there, and the doctors come in and take us to the lab and give us the good medicine, and we're okay. Cause you kept us safe. That's what happens next, Luffy says, finishing his ramblings and turning to Ace again, taking in the shocked expression on his brother's face, feeling the turmoil in him. The room's silent now as everyone takes in what Luffy had just said, no one speaking as they mull over his words. It stays this way for a few seconds that feel like hours, but finally Ace clears his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Alright, so say I believe this, how do I become 17 again? He asked, Sabou giving him a small smile. Apparently we just have to wait, the blonde said with a shrug, Ace giving him an incredulous look. Hey, don't look at me like that. If it were up to me this wouldn't have even happened in the first place, Sabou said holding his hands up defensively. Ace rolled his eyes, turning to look at the pirates now. Since I don't remember anything, what are your names? He asked roughly. He'd grown up with bandits and then was taken to a facility where he wasn't exactly given the best treatment, so of course, he didn't have the best people skills. I'm Whitebeard, the captain, Whitebeard said with a warm smile, one that made Ace pause. He hadn't seen someone smile to him like that since Emily, and before that it was Makino. No one else had ever looked at him like that, and he wondered how the captain managed to do it. Surely he knew what had happened in the facility. Sabou and Luffy didn't hesitate to talk about it in front of them. So how could he look at him like a person, and not a monster? He wasn't able to think on it much longer as the introductions continued, and he learned that everyone in here was a commander on the crew. Now that Ace seemed to believe them, they decided that they could leave the room now, Sabou and Luffy telling him that they were actually a part of the crew, something that he didn't know if he was going to be able to believe, but once they showed him their tattoos, it became a bit hard to deny it. All of them left the room, Ace asking Sabou and Luffy questions as they did, occasionally glancing at the commanders and captain who were following behind them as he did. Everything seemed to check out, but it was, still, unbelievable. I mean, it's not like it's a usual occurrence for someone to be sent back to their early teens with no memories of their future. We even went to Fishman Island, but it's under the water so we had to get this cool bubble around the whole ship. And we saved Shiba Shiro Shirahoshi from this mean pirate. Luffy said happily beside him. Sabou nodding when Luffy finally got the name right. Oh yeah? Ace asked a bit absent-mindedly as he once again glanced behind them. And you were mad cause you beat Barbara with one hit. Luffy said, laughing to himself while Sabou corrected the name to Decan, making Ace wonder how Luffy had gotten it so wrong. Also, Barbara was a girl's name, right? Besides Lou, this is Ace we're talking about, he's still mad, Sabou said, rolling his eyes and sending Ace a smirk. He returned it with a scowl, but that only made Sabou laugh at him. Haha, let's make fun of the guy who doesn't have the memories to defend himself, and for the record, I bet I'm not still angry about it. Ace remarked indignantly, sticking his tongue out childishly at Sabou, who returned the gesture. Ace decided to ignore the snickers he heard coming from the group behind them. They finally walked back out onto the deck and, like before, all eyes turned to look at him. Of course, when Ace was uncomfortable the only way he knew how to express that discomfort was to get angry, which is exactly what he did. He bristled, tensed, and a glare formed on his face. He was ready to start yelling or cursing, maybe even both, but Luffy grabbed his hand instead. It stopped him from speaking as he turned to look at his younger wait, weren't they the same age now? It didn't matter, he would always be Luffy's older brother, and besides, his birthday was the first of the year. So he was still the oldest anyhow brother and saw the childish smile from all those years ago light up on Luffy's face. Nay, Ace, let's go look at the waves. They're really pretty, and we can look at the sky too, and the clouds but not the sun. Sabou says we shouldn't look at the sun cause it'll hurt our eyes, and Sabou's smart so he's probably right. But what if we could look at the sun? What do you think it would look like? I bet it would look like a lemon. Oh, or maybe an egg? Or meat? Sabou watched as Luffy dragged Ace off to the railing, their usual spot near Whitebeard, rambling on and on, yet effectively distracting Ace from all the curious eyes that had been looking his way. It always amazed him how effortlessly Luffy could distract someone, whether he meant to do it or not. Sabou had seen the way Ace had tensed, the look on his brother's face screaming how uncomfortable he was and how he was, naturally, channeling all of that discomfort into anger. Luffy had surely felt it as well, but now he dragged Ace off and stopped him from thinking about it, instead showing him the freedom that their brother didn't quite know he had yet. Sabou walked over to them, noticing that the commanders were all dispersing and Whitebeard was heading to his chair. Ace and Luffy were sitting on the railing, so Sabou opted to sit where Ace normally did on the ground, back against the wall like railing. He looked up, watching the sky as he listened to Luffy continue to ramble on and on about what different foods the sun could look like. Ace occasionally responded, but for the most part, remained silent. After a little bit of this, Luffy's eyes shifted away from the sky, a slight frown forming as he turned his head slightly to look at the deck out of the corner of his eye. He started to tap, and Sabou immediately started translating the words in his head until Luffy suddenly stopped, frown leaving into a sheepish grin. "Ah, right," he said aloud, confusing Sabou until Luffy began using the more expressive silent language, the only 114-year-old Oz Luffy signed, Sabou turning his head to watch as well, and the blonde immediately frowned, Ace looking confused. "Let's go to Whitebeard," Sabou signed. Ace asked what was happening, but Sabou told him he'd explain once they were with the captain, eyes looking across the deck towards something. Ace looked as well but didn't know who he was looking at. He frowned, not liking being in the dark, but followed his brothers as they walked over to the captain who didn't look surprised in the slightest at their appearance. "Teach is a bad guy, we're watching him. Whitebeards know and are watching him too. We've been waiting for him to do something," Sabou explained to Ace, whose frown deepened, but he nodded his understanding. Obviously, his future self, or was it present self, past self, de-aging was confusing, hadn't done anything to stop the man, so he guessed he was okay with the plan they had in place. He didn't mean he liked it though, but really, he didn't like any of this. It was still an unbelievable situation he was in after all. They had only been sitting with the captain for a half hour, Ace listening to him tell stories, when he felt the familiar fuzziness of his mind clue him into the fact that he was about to have a sleep attack. Within seconds of this realization, he was slumping forward, but Luffy caught him before any damage could be done. Sabou's eyes drifted briefly to Ace in concern before focusing back to the deck as he listened to Teach. The attack didn't last more than 2 minutes, but that didn't stop the commanders nearby from watching in concern. It didn't look fun to suddenly lose consciousness in the middle of whatever you were doing. Ace woke up, springing upwards immediately, eyes hazy and unfocused as he tried figuring out where he was, what happened, and what he'd missed. "With Whitebeards, he stopped his story for you. Sabou's still listening," Luffy said softly to him. Ace cleared his throat and blinked a few times, trying to ignore the stares from the commanders and captain as he nodded. "Sorry," Ace cut off as he slumped again, Luffy immediately catching him once again, frowning. Sabou stopped listening to Teach, watching Ace with concern while the commanders blinked in surprise. Ace had never had 2 attacks so close together like that, and they wondered if it was a bad thing. "Forgot how bad they used to be," Sabou muttered as he helped Luffy try and position their brother into a more comfortable position. "So, it's normal to have 2 attacks back to back?" Fosa asked. "Not exactly. It's possible, but it's more that with a lack of sleep and poor health, not to mention extreme emotional states nearly constantly, the attacks can get worse. When we were in the facility, it wasn't surprising for Ace to have multiple attacks daily, multiple days in a row. With his body being set back like it has, we should expect him to have a lot of sleep attacks until he's back to normal, and maybe even a little after that," Sabou explained as Ace began to wake up again, looking confused once more. Luffy immediately launched back into a retelling of what he'd missed while Sabou went back to listening to Teach, but not before sending Ace a look of concern. The commanders all tried their best to focus anywhere but Ace, knowing that the young teen wouldn't take too kindly to them staring. They were basically strangers to him now, even if that was a strange thought to have. Whitebeard launched back into his storytelling, starting from right before Ace had fallen asleep to assure that the oldest, now tied youngest, didn't miss anything. Ace looked around with shifty eyes, almost daring someone to ask about his attacks, but when no one said anything to him he gradually relaxed, absorbed in the story once again. Eventually, it was time for lunch to begin. The brothers held back for a minute with Whitebeard and Marco, all of them knowing that it would be best to let the rush head into the galley first before heading there themselves, especially with a fresh out of the facility Ace. As the deck slowly emptied, the group decided to head in as well, Ace trailing along, almost unsure. Inside was a rambunctious crowd of pirates, all getting plates of food and chatting loudly amongst themselves as they did. Ace's eyes scanned everything and everyone, taking in all the sounds, scents, and sights he could. He followed his brothers to a spot at a table filled with all of the commanders, Whitebeard, and Marco sitting with them as they did. Ace didn't even have to wonder where they were going to get their food or what food he should even be expecting to get when the chef, Thatch's mind supplied, came bustling over with plates on platters piled high with delicious-looking food. One of the large servings went to the captain, which made sense, but the rest all came straight to the brothers, Sabou thanking the chef while Luffy licked his lips excitedly, bouncing in place. Ace could only stare, dumbfounded, at his plate filled with a delicious array of foods, some still steaming. His mouth watered as he looked to Sabou, almost as if to ask if he was allowed to eat, and when the blonde nodded, a smile on his face, Ace still couldn't find it in himself to eat. Years had passed, at least in his mind it had, since he'd last eaten a proper meal, actual food. It was foreign to him, but he picked up his fork regardless, waiting for someone to laugh and take the food from him, replace it with the ungodly bowl of soup the doctors called a meal. No one stopped him though, and he slowly picked some food up on his fork before eating it, the flavors exploding in his mouth and nearly bringing tears to his eyes. "It's good, right? Thatch makes the best food ever, better than the gross soup," Luffy said joyously at his side, tongue sticking out in disgust at the mention of the soup. Ace, still speechless, could only nod while Thatch beamed in pride. To be fair, I think anything anyone cooks would taste better than the soup, but I had to agree, Thatch's food is pretty good, Sabou said from where he sat on Luffy's other side. The normalcy between Sabou and Luffy was off-putting to Ace, but he tried to take it in stride, knowing that this was a strange situation for everyone and it wouldn't do anyone any good if he went and got angry for things no one could control. Besides, he was too happy that he was eating real, honest-to-goodness food to care about anything else right now. Lunch passed in a blur of bliss for Ace. He ignored all of the conversations around him, grateful no one was attempting to force him into any conversation in the first place. His food was scarfed down in record timing, and he almost wished he had savored it more for when he inevitably had to eat that green garbage again. But they were out. The concept, along with many others, was still strange to him as well. To be free. Out of the facility. He and his brothers had been there for years, and to wake up after a test to find he had escaped, had been out of the facility for months without remembering any of it, was something that he would probably never wrap his mind around. He tried not to focus too much on that though, following his brothers as they talked about how they should go take bathes now that lunch was over. As much as Ace longed to take an actual bath, to get clean, he couldn't stop the flashbacks of only hours ago where, in his mind, he had been forced into tanks of water, forced to hold his breath until he was drowning, and then even longer than that. He shivered involuntarily, ignoring Luffy as he looked his way with a hint of a frown. They reached the bathroom within minutes of walking, and the process of getting cleaned was so mundane, so normal, something Ace never thought he'd have the luxury of doing again, that it was almost as good as when he got to eat actual food again. It was practically therapeutic. "So how long have we, been here?" Ace asked once the three were back in their room. Luffy had been complaining that his hair was starting to get too long and wanted Sabou to cut it for him, which was what the blonde was getting ready to in their desk chair while Sabou held a pair of scissors, brushing Luffy's hair as straight as possible with his fingers, removing tangles as he did. "About 2 months. Almost 3. Sabou answered without thought, still absorbed in his task. He chastised Luffy for squirming in his chair too much, which made Ace smile before asking another question. "And we joined? Like, joined?" Ace asked, looking to the tattoo he could see on Sabou's shoulder. His brother was wearing a sleeveless shirt for the moment, showing off both his tattoo and his scars. Luffy turned to look at Ace, grin on his face. They said we could leave whenever we wanted if we wanted to, so he decided we'd join him. I'm still gonna be king of the pirates though, so I'm gonna leave when I'm 17. Luffy said determinedly, Sabou raising an eyebrow. "Oh, 17? He asked. From the sounds of it, Luffy had never mentioned that before? "Yeah, 'cause we got out when you guys were 17, so I'll leave when I'm 17. Luffy affirmed. Sabou chuckled, snipping a few chunks of hair away as he did. "Well, I guess that means you'll be here for another few years then," he said fondly. Ace watched silently from the bed, a warmth in his chest as he did. His brothers both seemed happy, something he'd always wanted for them. He'd always been told he was a monster, a child of the devil, someone who should never have been born, much less someone who deserved happiness. He deserved to have horrible things done to him, like the facility, like all the tests, all the pain, he deserved it. But Sabou and Luffy? They didn't. His two brothers were innocent in all of this. They didn't deserve to have to go through everything that happened at the facility. They deserved freedom, they deserved happiness, they deserved a world without him in it. Without him, they wouldn't have been tainted by his demon blood. Dragged into his world that was filled with pain, with unfairness, with despair. If it meant his brothers could be free, could be happy, he would spend the rest of his life in the facility. Hell, he would die if it meant they never had to worry about something as horrible as the facility ever again. "You're the best, Ace," Luffy said, snapping the older Raven from his thoughts. Ace looked to his brother, blinking in confusion as Luffy turned to smile to him. It wasn't his bright, big, smile. It was softer, smaller, but it showed just as much emotion as any other smile he'd ever shown before. Thanks," Ace muttered, face flushing at the sudden compliment, his gaze dropping to the blankets he sat on rather than his brother. He didn't understand how anyone could like him, much less willingly become brothers with him. He didn't deserve it, but when Luffy said things like that, he almost believed it. Almost felt like he could have the family he'd always desperately wanted. It was selfish of him, but he wanted it. It was quiet amongst them as Sabou finished trimming Luffy's hair, and then the blonde was handing him the scissors, asking Ace to cut his hair for him, which Ace agreed to, standing and heading to the chair. As Luffy stood, he turned and hugged Ace tightly, both shocking and stopping him from moving any further. "Luffy?" Ace asked in confusion, not sure what to do. He knew Luffy was clingy, not to mention much more affectionate than he was, but this had been so sudden, without reason, that it was unexpected. Luffy hummed, face buried out of view. Ace was shorter than his 17-year-old self but still taller than Luffy was by a few inches, so when Luffy pulled away his grinning face was only mere inches below his. She, your face is funny, Ace." Luffy laughed as he bounced over to the bed. Ace sputtered, trying to figure out if it was an insult or not, but he couldn't respond when he heard Sabou laughing from where he sat in his chair. What, cat got your tongue, Ace? Gotta say, Luffy's right, your face is pretty funny. Sabou laughed. Ace glared at the blonde as he walked over, snipping the scissors a few times in the air. Oh yeah? I think you forgot that I'm about to cut your hair. Let's see if I can make it look as funny as my face then. Ace threatened. Sabou blanched, ducking when Ace made a grab for his head, still holding the scissors in the air, ready to cut. Gaw, hey, whoa, no, hey Ace, stop no, I was kidding, don't you dare. Luffy laughed loudly as he watched his two older brothers, Sabou ducking and diving around their room as Ace chased him with the scissors, barking at the blonde to hold still. The heavy feelings that had been coming from Ace earlier were long gone now, only replaced by the light feelings of happiness, warmth, love. The youngest basked in those feelings. They radiated from his brothers like furnaces, and he found himself letting them all in. If it could always be like this, then that would truly be paradise. Waking up, Ace was extremely disoriented. His head hurt, his body ached, and he felt older, as if a lot of time had passed in the blink of an eye. He couldn't really remember exactly where he was. He had memories of this place, but they felt far away as if he experienced this all months ago. At the forefront of his memory, he could see the facility. He felt as if just last night, he'd fallen asleep in their dark, cold cell. The memory of the amazing meal from the chef was long gone, replaced by the taste of the soup he felt he had just eaten last night. The feeling of actually getting clean was gone. Instead, he felt grimy and dirty, sweaty, gross. All of the pleasantness he remembered from the Whitebeard's ship was replaced with the onslaught of memories he suddenly had from the facility. Beside him, Luffy shifted. Not on the ground, not groaning in pain and discomfort, but snuggling further into the blankets and the mattress beneath him. Sabou was on the other end, sleeping peacefully, without a care. Luffy's straw hat sat on the nightstand with two other hats, one that looked strikingly familiar to Ace as Sabou's old hat, and one he remembered to have been wearing when he was with the Whitebeards. Had that been a dream? Or had the facility been the dream? He was with the Whitebeards now, but he felt as if he had been in the facility just last night. What had Sabou told him before? It felt like digging for a distant memory, and even then he couldn't exactly remember the words spoken. It felt as if that night had happened a year ago, fuzzy and hard to picture. Nightmare? Sabou's voice broke him from his thoughts, the blonde yawning as he sat up and rubbed his eyes. Huh? Ace asked dumbly, still not sure what was happening. Did you have a nightmare? Sabou asked, blinking a few times as he spoke. No, what's happening? Ace asked as he looked around the room, remembering it from what felt like all that time ago. Sabou was quiet a moment as he watched Ace before recognition flashed in his eyes. Right, 14-year-old Ace. I forgot about that. Sabou muttered to himself with a sigh. 15. Ace corrected absently as he continued inspecting the room, practically waiting for a doctor to come barging in. What? Now it was Sabou's turn to be confused as he turned to look back at Ace, halfway out of the bed. I'm 15 now. I was 14 though, right? I remember everything from the next year, but I don't really remember what happened here. Yesterday? Ace said, the last bit coming out as a question, almost as if he didn't know when yesterday was. Yeah, yesterday. You were hit with a devil fruit that made you 14. Sabou explained briefly. Ace nodded, remembering vaguely that Sabou had told that to him. In between them Luffy shuffled again, eyebrows furrowing and a frown forming on his face, cluing the two in on the nightmare he was probably experiencing. Sabou was quick to turn to Luffy and soothe him, breaking the boy from his dreaming before it got any worse. Ace could only watch as Luffy looked around with wide eyes for a minute before calming, getting out of bed and heading to the desk in their room. So what's the then, now that you're 15 and all? Sabou asked quietly, though both the older brothers were watching Luffy closely as he pulled out a journal and started writing. Ace swallowed at the mention of the fresh memories, eyes drifting from Luffy to the blankets underneath his hands. Luffy died. Ace murmured, just as quiet as Sabou had been, if not quieter. Sabou frowned beside him. But they saved him. Damn doctors. Ace cursed, hands forming fists as he clutched the blankets. The two remained silent, the only sound in the room being the sound of Luffy's pen scratching across the paper as he wrote. Do you remember anything about yesterday? About being here? Sabou asked in an attempt to change the subject. He didn't like remembering Luffy's death any more than Ace did, but his brother remembered it clearer than he did as if it had happened only days ago. I remembered talking to all the commanders and stuff. I don't remember what their names were, and I can't really remember what we talked about. I just remember that I'm not supposed to be 15 and that we're not in the facility anymore. Ace said with a shrug, looking back at Luffy. Right. Well, I need to head to the galley really quick. Luffy, when you're done writing you and Ace can head there too. Thatch is done with breakfast. I'll see you both soon, alright? Sabou said, getting out of the bed and getting ready, heading to the door. Ace gave him a look of confusion, but nodded, Luffy doing the same. Sabou took that as a sign that he could leave, so he did, sighing heavily as he closed the door behind him. It was a good thing that Ace seemed to be returning to his proper age, but the consequence of it meant his brother had to relive all of those horrible days in the facility all over again. It was one thing to talk about them, to relive them through words, but to experience them all over again was a completely different thing. Sabou could only hope this was all over soon. Walking into the galley, he saw that most everyone was there. Apparently, the brothers had slept in longer than usual. He headed straight for the commander's table, many in the room noticing he was alone, which earned him a few curious looks that he ignored. "Sabou, where are Ace and Luffy?" Flamenco asked as the blonde sat at the table, drawing everyone's attention. "Back in our room. They'll be here shortly, which is why I need to talk to you quickly before they do get here," Sabou said, voice soft but urgent as he folded his hands on the table, frowning. "Is everything all right, son?" Whitebeard asked in concern, a frown on his face as well as he observed Sabou. "For the most part, yes. Ace is 15 now, which is great. It means he's returning back to his normal age," Sabou began, everyone nodding along in understanding. However, being 15, he remembers everything from the facility too clearly. "Yesterday, from what I've gathered, feels as if it happened a year ago. He doesn't remember your names or exactly what we talked about. He just remembers he was here and talked with us," Sabou explained. "What's the last thing he remembers, Yoi?" Marco asked, having a feeling whatever Ace remembered was a part of the issue. Sabou's frown deepened, hands grasping to each other tighter. "Luffy's death," Sabou said, voice dropping even lower at the mention. Everyone frowned at his words, all of them understanding the reason for this conversation now. Seeing as it's fresh in his mind, he's probably going to hover around Luffy. He and I both kept Luffy within our sights as much as possible after he died, so it'd be best that no one mentions it. Ace has a hard time handling his own emotions, so if someone brings it up he'll most likely explode in anger, which won't do anyone any good," Sabou said with a sigh, knowing his younger brother had a tendency to get angry rather than deal with his feelings properly. "And now that he remembers how, he'll probably start tapping to us again. It'd also be best if you don't tell him you understand the tapping," Sabou said, not wanting Ace to feel like he didn't have any privacy anymore. "We understand. Is that all?" Whitebeard asked. "I think so. Ace and Luffy are here anyway," Sabou said, not even turning to face the door as it opened, the two brothers walking in hand. It wasn't all that obvious, but after what Sabou had told them, they noticed that Ace was definitely a lot closer to Luffy than he normally would be, eyes scanning the area around them quickly as they walked. Sabou turned to look at them once he heard they were closer, giving the two a smile as he did. "Sabou, you didn't eat without us, right?" Luffy asked with a pout as he sat beside the blonde. Sabou huffed out a laugh, rolling his eyes. "Of course not, Luffy, right Thatch?" Sabou asked the chef, who smiled and shook his head. "Nope, I refused to serve him until you two were here," Thatch said as he stood and left the table, heading off to get their food. Satisfied, Luffy smiled and Ace sat on Luffy's other side, eyes still shifting around the room and a frown on his face. "What are their names?" Ace asked his brothers, unaware that the commanders and captain could understand the silent language. Haruta opened his mouth, most likely to answer the unspoken question, but Izo stomped on his foot, stopping the commander, who immediately remembered Sabou's words. "The cool giant is the captain, he's Mr. Whitebeard, and Marco's his first mate. He's the one who looks bored, and across from him is Izo. He's really pretty, and next to him." Luffy continued naming the commanders for Ace, Sabou smiling at some of the observations his brother made about the commanders. The commanders and captain all tried to pretend they couldn't understand the words, even if Luffy calling Flamenco the funny man with the face pockets was hilarious. "Bon appetit," Thatch announced as he came over, platters in hand as he served the three. "Thank you, Thatch," Sabou said, more for Ace so he could associate the chef with a name. "No problem, Sabou," Thatch said as he sat in front of them again. Breakfast was fairly normal, save for Ace asking his brothers questions about things that he couldn't remember, like what they normally did on the ship, whether they were a part of the crew or not, and if they were allowed to eat more than just one serving. Ace's reaction to the food was the same as it had been yesterday, the flavors nearly overwhelming him as he ate eagerly. It was as if he hadn't eaten in years, which wasn't far from the truth in the teen's mind. When they were finished, the three left to go sit in their spot, Ace still sticking to Luffy like glue as they did. The boy didn't seem to mind, practically basking in his brother's affection. Most of their day was spent at the railing, Ace sitting beside Luffy while Sabou sat on the ground. Ace asked more questions, like how they even managed to escape the facility, and they answered diligently, always reassuring him that they were safe, that they were out. Lunch came, the brothers ate, and then they were right back at the railing, watching the sky, the clouds, the sea. At one point, when everything was peaceful, calm, Ace could feel the fuzziness once again, the warning sign of an attack. Sleep attack. Ace sighed quickly, already feeling his body shut down on him. Luffy, who had felt the incoming signs as well, pushed Ace back and off the railing, Sabou catching their brother to save him from landing harshly on the deck. It beat falling into the ocean. "He alright?" Namur, the commander closest to them, asked, obviously concerned. Yeah, just another attack, Sabou said with a sigh as he positioned his brother as comfortably as possible against the railing. They really did happen a lot, huh? He asked as he looked at Ace. He could only imagine how annoying it must be to suddenly lose the ability to stay awake, to just suddenly pass out without any say in the matter. Too often. It didn't make much of a difference when all we had to do was sit in a cell, but it was still annoying. More so for Ace, obviously, Sabou said with a sigh as he also watched his sleeping brother. Luffy murmured softly from where he sat, still facing the ocean. Sabou frowned, ears pricking as he zeroed in on where Teach was just walking out onto the deck, the man's eyes turning their way immediately as he did. I think it'd be best that we go to our room for now, Sabou suggested, Luffy nodding in agreement as he stood up off the railing. Sabou moved to lift Ace, but Namur stopped him, picking their sleeping brother up effortlessly. I can get him for you, just lead the way, Namur said with a smile. The two brothers thanked him before heading off towards their room. Once they reached the room they thanked Namur once more before waiting for Ace to wake up. They explained what he'd missed, explained to him that Teach was bad, explained to him that they were watching him. And then they stayed in their room until dinner, and then even after dinner. The next day, Ace was 16, remembering everything up to when Luffy went through the Pure Souls tests. With the way things were going, Ace would be back to 17 by the next day. Whether he remembered everything by tomorrow or not though, was unknown to them. After, once again, explaining everything about the previous 2 days, which felt like a year ago to Ace, the three headed off to the galley for breakfast. Another round of explanations later, and everyone was caught up on Ace's current age and memories. Afterward, the three spent their day the same way they did the previous 2 days, showing Ace all the freedom they had rather than letting him sit and remember all the freedom they didn't have back at the facility. They tried showing him how there were no doctors here, no tests. There was food, baths, clothes, beds. It was a better place, whether it was a pirate ship or not. Sure, Teach was the one thorn in their side that consistently reminded them that, while most here were good people, he was not. He was someone that was as bad as Haru, someone who threw them all back into their memories about that place. They avoided him at all costs, but the damage was done already. That didn't mean they couldn't try again the next day.